A crown can look powerful from a distance. From far away, the scene in Rome on Christmas Day, 800, seems almost simple. A Frankish king kneels in prayer, Pope Leo III raises an imperial crown, and the title of Roman Emperor returns to the West after centuries of absence. But the closer one gets to that moment, the less simple it becomes. The place mattered. This was not Aachen, Charlemagne's favored royal center, where his own court, chapel and officials could frame the ceremony on Frankish terms. This was Rome, the city of apostles, martyrs, ruined imperial walls, old basilicas, papal factions, and memories too large for the politics that still lived among them. Inside old St. Peter's Basilica, the air would have carried wax smoke, damp stone, wool cloaks, and the metal smell of armed men standing near sacred space. A Roman cleric watching from the side would not have seen an abstract rebirth of empire. He would have seen something more fragile and more practical. A pope who needed a protector, and a northern king whose victories needed a language older than conquest. That is where this empire begins. Not in a clean constitution, not in a fixed border, but in a ceremony built from pressure. Pope Leo III had reasons to need Charlemagne. In 799, Leo had been attacked in Rome by political enemies who accused him of wrongdoing and tried to remove him from power. He escaped, fled north, and sought Charlemagne's help. The Frankish ruler did not arrive in Italy as a neutral pilgrim. He came as the most powerful lay ruler in Western Europe, the man whose armies had subdued the Lombards, forced long wars against the Saxons, pushed against the Avars, and tied military expansion to Christian rule. For Leo, Charlemagne's presence offered security. For Charlemagne, Rome offered something no battlefield could give by itself, a sacred frame for power. A conqueror can take land. A ruler must make obedience last. By 800, Charlemagne already possessed more than enough force to terrify neighboring peoples. But force alone could not explain why bishops should support him, why local elites should cooperate with his officials, why distant territories should accept reform, or why a Frankish king should stand above other kings. The imperial title gave his victories a wider grammar. It connected Frankish power to Rome, Christian order, and the old idea that one ruler might guard the peace of the church. Yet the crown created a problem at the same time it solved one. If the Pope could place the crown on the emperor's head, then the emperor's dignity was not entirely self-made. It passed through papal hands, and if imperial authority needed a sacred ritual to become visible, then future popes could argue that the church was not merely blessing power, it was judging it. That tension would not explode immediately, but it was already present in the room. Charlemagne's new title also complicated the older Roman world to the east. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire still existed. Its rulers did not think Rome had vanished and waited for the Franks to revive it. From their perspective, the Roman imperial line continued in the east. The situation in 800 was even more politically awkward because the Byzantine throne was held by Empress Irene, whose rule gave Western clerics and Frankish advisors room to claim that the imperial office in Constantinople, that claim was convenient. It was not neutral. So the coronation did not simply restore Rome. It created a rival interpretation of Rome. There was the Rome of the city, where Leo had enemies and needed soldiers. There was the Rome of the church, where papal ritual could turn conquest into sacred office. There was the Rome of Constantinople, still alive and unwilling to disappear from history. And there was the Rome Charlemagne could use. Not a functioning ancient state, but a name powerful enough to make a new order feel ancient. This is why the Holy Roman Empire cannot be treated as an ordinary kingdom growing slowly into a modern nation. Its first logic was not national. It was imperial, Christian, and symbolic, but always tied to material needs. The papacy needed armed protection. The Frankish monarchy needed legitimacy. Bishops needed a ruler strong enough to discipline violence. Local elites needed to know whether cooperation with the new order would protect their land, offices, and status. A small scene reveals the larger structure. Somewhere outside the ceremonial center, a Frankish count or royal agent could carry orders that sounded grand in Latin, but had to be enforced in mud, villages, monasteries, toll roads, and borderlands. Reform meant records. Christian order meant priests, schools, punishments, and inspections. Imperial language might rise under the basilica roof, but on the ground it became disputes over land grants, military service, oaths, and who had the right to command men who had never seen Rome. That gap between sacred claim and local reality would shape everything that followed. Charlemagne's achievement was enormous because he could hold the gap together through personal authority. His court promoted learning. His officials tried to supervise local power. His alliance with the church gave his rule a moral vocabulary. His armies made resistance dangerous. Under him, the imperial idea had a body strong enough to carry it, but the body was mortal. When Charlemagne died in 814, the title remained, but the political weight beneath it shifted onto his son Louis the Pious. Louis inherited not only lands and honors, but the burden of making a conquest empire behave like a stable order. He also inherited the old problem that ritual cannot remove. Sons, inheritance, ambition, and competing claims wrapped in religious language. The Frankish world tried to manage succession before it destroyed unity. The Ordinatio Imperii of 817 attempted to arrange the empire under Louis's heir Lothar while assigning subordinate kingdoms to other sons. It was meant to preserve hierarchy. Instead, as family politics changed and new heirs entered the picture, the settlement became one more object of dispute. Civil war followed. Oaths were broken and remade. Bishops took sides. Armies marched under banners that still claimed Christian order while fighting over the division of a Christian empire. By 843, the Treaty of Verdun formalized what the coronation of 800 could not prevent. The Carolingian world was divided among Louis's surviving sons. West Francia under Charles the Bald, East Francia under Louis the German, and Middle Francia under Lothar. The names sound administrative, but the consequence was immense. West Francia would become the seedbed of France. East Francia would become the base from which later German kings rebuilt the imperial title. The middle zone, stretching through lands that later generations would fight over again and again, became a corridor of wealth, vulnerability, and contested memory. The empire had not disappeared as an idea. It had lost its single political body. This matters because the Holy Roman Empire's later story grows from that wound. The imperial title promised unity, but the lands beneath it moved toward division. Rome gave the crown a sacred aura, but no basilica could solve inheritance law. The church could bless authority, but bishops and popes were political actors inside the same struggle. A ruler could speak in the name of Christian order, but his power still had to pass through dukes, counts, abbots, cities, roads, armies, and family settlements. The coronation of 800 therefore left two legacies. The first was the dream, a Christian empire in the West, carrying Roman memory through Frankish power. The second was the contradiction, an emperor whose highest legitimacy came from a ritual he did not fully control. Later emperors would spend centuries trying to master that contradiction. Otto I would rebuild imperial authority from East Francia and the German duchies. Henry IV would discover at Canossa that excommunication could turn sacred legitimacy into political danger. Frederick Barbarossa would march into Italy to make imperial rights real in cities rich enough to resist him. Charles IV would give the empire an electoral structure through the Golden Bull of 1356, stabilizing the crown by accepting that powerful princes would shape it. Charles V would try to hold Christian unity during the Reformation and learn that a sacred empire could not easily command divided belief. But all of that lay ahead. In the year 800, there was still the controlled beauty of the ceremony. Latin prayers, papal hands, Frankish steel, Roman stone, and a title that seemed to pull the dead empire back into speech. To the crowd, it may have looked like restoration. To history, it was something more unstable. The Holy Roman Empire began as a promise that local power could be made universal if it wore the right crown, received the right blessing, and spoke in the name of Rome. For a while, Charlemagne was strong enough to make that promise believable. Then he died, and once the man was gone, the crown had to find another structure capable of carrying its weight. It would not find one easily. The first crack in Charlemagne's empire did not look like invasion. It looked like inheritance. No foreign army had to burn Aachen to weaken the imperial dream. No pagan king had to tear the crown from a chapel wall. The danger was already inside the Frankish system, written into family expectation, aristocratic custom, and the simple fact that a ruler with sons rarely leaves behind only one ambition. When Charlemagne died in 814, his empire did not immediately collapse. That would be too clean, too dramatic, and too false. The machinery he had built still moved. Messengers still carried orders. Counts still held courts. Monasteries still copied books. Bishops still preached reform. The imperial title passed to his surviving son, Louis the Pious, who had been prepared for rule and crowned co-emperor before his father's death. For a brief moment, continuity seemed possible. Louis was not a weak man in the cartoon sense. He was not simply the son who ruined his father's achievement because he lacked courage. That version is too easy. His problem was more difficult. He inherited an empire that looked unified from above, but remained deeply local from below. A count in Aquitaine, a bishop in Bavaria, a monastery near the Rhine, a noble family in Saxony, each belonged to the empire, but not in the same way. Their loyalty passed through personal bonds, land grants, oaths, expectations, rivalries, and memories of recent conquest. Charlemagne had held these pieces together through reputation, movement, threat, and reward. Louis had to turn that personal inheritance into a stable order. So he tried to solve the problem before it destroyed him. In 817, Louis issued the Ordinatio Imperii. It was not just a family arrangement. It was an attempt to protect the unity of the empire by giving his eldest son, Lothar, a superior imperial position, while assigning subordinate kingdoms to his other sons, Pippin and Louis. The idea was practical and theological at once. One empire, one hierarchy, one Christian order, with room for royal sons, but not enough room to shatter the whole structure. On parchment, it made sense. In a palace chapel, spoken before bishops and magnates, it may even have sounded sacred. But families do not live on parchment. The first problem was that subordinate kings do not always remain subordinate in their own minds. The second was that aristocrats around each royal son could see their own future in the succession. A prince was never only a prince. He was a center of patronage. Around him gathered men who wanted offices, lands, influence, protection, and revenge against rivals. To support a son was to gamble on the map of tomorrow. Then the imperial household changed. Louis remarried after the death of his first wife, and his new wife, Judith of Bavaria, gave birth to another son, Charles, later known as Charles the Bald. That birth changed the political arithmetic. A new child required a share. But to create a share for Charles meant reopening a settlement that had already promised status and territory to his older half-brothers. The empire did not break because men forgot Christianity. It broke because Christian kings still had sons. Imagine a scribe in the imperial court trying to copy a settlement whose meaning has already begun to rot. The ink is precise. The names are formal. Lothar, Pippin, Louis, Charles. Kingdoms, rights, honors, oaths. But outside the room, messengers wait with news from magnates who are not thinking in abstractions. They want to know which son will control which land, which court will distribute which office, which bishop will support which claimant, and whether yesterday's loyalty will be punished by tomorrow's victor. That is the real texture of imperial fracture. Not a single dramatic betrayal, but dozens of calculations spreading through the nobility. By the 830s, Louis the Pious faced rebellion from his own sons. The conflicts were not steady lines on a modern map. They shifted through alliances, reconciliations, humiliations, assemblies, oaths, and reversals. In 833, at a place later remembered as the Field of Lies near Colmar, Louis's support collapsed when many of his followers abandoned him. He was forced into submission by his sons and subjected to public penance. That scene matters because it echoes the problem first exposed in Rome. Imperial power needed sacred legitimacy, but sacred legitimacy could be turned against the emperor himself. A ruler who failed to maintain moral and political confidence could be made to kneel not only before enemies, but before the language of Christian correction. The father of the empire's heirs became a penitent in a struggle his own succession planning had failed to contain. Louis eventually recovered power, but recovery was not restoration. The damage had entered the structure. When he died in 840, the unresolved conflict became open war among his surviving sons. Luther claimed imperial superiority. Louis the German and Charles the Bald resisted being reduced beneath him. Armies moved not as strangers crossing into empire, but as brothers fighting through their father's inheritance. The strangest part is that each side could claim to defend order. Lothar could argue that imperial unity required hierarchy. Louis and Charles could argue that their rights could not be swallowed by an elder brother wearing a greater title. Bishops, abbots, counts, and nobles chose sides not only from belief, but from interest. The empire's sacred vocabulary remained intact, but it no longer produced obedience. In 842, Louis the German and Charles the Bald swore the oaths of Strasbourg against Lothar. The oaths are famous partly because they were recorded in early forms of Romance and Germanic speech, a small linguistic window into a political world already moving apart. The moment was not the birth of modern France and Germany in a neat sense. History is rarely so tidy. But it showed that the Carolingian inheritance was no longer one unquestioned political body. Men had begun to speak loyalty across difference, against an imperial brother who claimed superiority. 1 year later, in 843, the Treaty of Verdun gave the fracture a formal shape. Lothar kept the imperial title and received Middle Francia, a long and awkward band of territory stretching from the North Sea through lands along the Rhine and down toward Italy. Charles the Bald received West Francia. Louis the German received East Francia. No treaty can know what future centuries will make of it. The men who negotiated Verdun were not sitting down to create France and Germany as modern nation-states. They were trying to stop a family war, divide claims, and stabilize a political inheritance that had become unmanageable. But Verdun mattered because it turned a temporary settlement into geography. West Francia would develop its own royal line, its own struggles, and eventually the long project of French monarchy. East Francia would become the world of German kingship, duchies, bishops, and frontier warfare. The world from which Otto I would later rise. The Middle Kingdom, Lothar's inheritance, was rich but exposed, a corridor of imperial memory without enough geographic coherence to remain whole. Its lands would become prizes, borders, and wounds. The empire Charlemagne had gathered under one authority was now a divided inheritance. And yet, the idea of empire did not die. That is the important point. If this were only a story of collapse, it would be simpler. Charlemagne builds, sons divide, empire ends. But medieval political ideas do not vanish just because borders change. Titles survive. Ceremonies survive. Claims survive. Bishops continue to remember old hierarchies. Courts continue to use imperial language. Rulers continue to want more than kingship when kingship feels too small for their ambition. The Roman name remained useful because it solved a problem no ordinary regional title could solve. It allowed a ruler to say, "My authority is not merely local. My crown belongs to a larger Christian order. My rule continues something older than my dynasty." Even when that claim was not fully true, it was too powerful to abandon. In East Francia, this mattered most. The eastern lands were not a single smooth kingdom. They contained powerful duchies, Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and others, each with local elites who could not simply be treated as royal servants. The king had to negotiate, discipline, reward, and sometimes fight them. He needed bishops, because bishops could serve as administrators and counterweights to hereditary nobles. He needed military success, because frontier threats could either expose weakness or forge unity. This was the hard ground from which the later Holy Roman Empire would grow. Not from a perfect continuation of Charlemagne's state, from the failure of that state to remain whole. The broken inheritance created a new possibility. If the Western Frankish line moved toward its own kingdom and the Middle Lands remained contested, then the Eastern kings could present themselves as the heirs capable of reviving imperial order. They did not have Rome yet. They did not have a stable empire. They had duchies, bishops, frontiers, and a memory. But memory can be a political resource. A ruler who can claim to restore a lost order often sounds greater than a ruler who merely governs what already exists. That is why the Treaty of Verdun is not just an ending. It is also preparation. It prepared the stage for a different kind of empire. Less Frankish, more German in its political base. still Roman in its claim, still Christian in its language, still dependent on the uneasy relationship between crown, church, and local power. The First Empire had broken because one man's achievement could not survive the ambitions of heirs. The next imperial structure would learn from that failure, but never escape it completely. It would not be built as a simple inheritance. It would be built through election, negotiation, coronation, and force. Its rulers would need the consent, or at least the managed resistance, of dukes, bishops, princes, and popes. That made it weaker than Charlemagne's dream. It also made it harder to kill. A personal empire can die with a family. A negotiated empire can survive by changing shape. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the Carolingian world had become a field of competing memories. The title of emperor still existed, but often without the power Charlemagne had once given it. The western lands turned inward, the middle lands fragmented. The eastern kingdom, under pressure from nobles and enemies, waited for a ruler who could turn defense into legitimacy. That ruler would not come from Rome. He would come from the German East, and before he could claim the imperial crown, he would first have to prove that a king could master the men beneath him. The empire did not return first as a crown. It returned as a problem of survival. After Verdun, the Eastern Frankish kingdom was not waiting calmly for history to call it Germany. It was a hard, uneven political world of duchies, bishops, borderlands, and armed families who understood that royal authority was real only when it could arrive with soldiers, judgment, gifts, or punishment. A king could claim inheritance from Charlemagne, but a claim did not make Saxony obedient, Bavaria quiet, or the frontiers safe. East Francia had memory. It did not yet have mastery. That distinction matters. The later Holy Roman Empire would grow from this eastern base, but not because the Eastern Kingdom was naturally unified or destined to dominate Europe. It grew because rulers there learned that imperial language was useful only after local power had been forced into some kind of order. Before a king could pretend to carry Rome, he had to survive the dukes beneath him. The first major step came with Henry the Fowler, elected king in 919. Henry was a Saxon, not a Carolingian emperor trying to preserve a broken inheritance. His rule belonged to a different political reality. The Carolingian prestige had faded. The great duchies had become powerful. Magyar raids threatened the eastern lands, and kingship had to be rebuilt from negotiation, rather than assumed from old blood. Henry did not instantly turn East Francia into a centralized state. He could not. No king in his position could simply command the dukes like servants. Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, Bavaria, and Lotharingia each had its own elites, traditions, military followings, and jealous sense of dignity. A royal order sent too far without support could become only expensive ink. So Henry worked like a practical ruler in a fractured world. He made settlements with dukes. He strengthened defenses. He dealt with the Magyar threat by buying time when necessary and preparing for war when possible. Fortified places, mounted forces, and regional cooperation mattered more than grand imperial language. In the East, kingship had to be built around the ability to protect. A peasant near the frontier did not care whether a ruler carried Roman memory if riders came over the horizon and burned the storehouses. A bishop did not care about imperial theory if his church lands were exposed to raiders and local nobles ignored royal peace. A duke did not care for royal dignity unless that dignity could either reward him or hurt him. Henry understood enough of this to leave his son something stronger than ceremony. When he died in 936, Otto inherited not an empire, but a kingship with sharper bones. Otto Fis would put flesh on those bones. At Aachen, the place associated with Charlemagne, Otto's coronation as king in 936 carried deliberate symbolism. The message was not subtle. Otto's kingship wanted to stand in continuity with the old Carolingian world, but his power base was Saxon and Eastern. He was not reviving Charlemagne by copying him. He was using Charlemagne's memory to discipline a different political landscape. The challenge appeared almost immediately. The great men of the kingdom did not see themselves as passive ornaments around a throne. Dukes and royal relatives rebelled. Otto's own brother Henry became part of the opposition. The conflict was not a side note. It was the test that determined whether kingship would remain a negotiated dignity or become a force capable of breaking resistance. Otto survived by a combination of punishment, reconciliation, and strategic appointments. He used family members where he could. He relied heavily on bishops and abbots, not only because they were holy men, but because church offices could serve royal policy in ways hereditary dukes often would not. A bishop had land and administrative weight, but no legitimate sons to inherit a duchy in the same way a lay magnate might. In theory, this made bishops useful counterweights to noble families. This was not piety alone. It was architecture. Otto's kingdom was being held together by a deliberate alliance between crown and church. Cathedrals, abbeys, royal chapels, charters, and episcopal appointments became instruments of rule. Sacred offices helped solve secular problems. A bishop could pray, judge, collect, advise, host royal courts, and anchor royal influence in territories where a duke might prefer independence. Here the old danger returned in a quieter form. If the king used bishops as pillars of royal power, then the question of who controlled bishops would eventually become explosive. For Otto, it worked. For later emperors, it would become one of the greatest crises in medieval Europe. But before that crisis came victory. The Magyar raids had haunted the Eastern Kingdom for decades. These mounted raiders struck across Central Europe with speed that exposed the weakness of slow feudal response. For local communities, the threat was not theoretical. It meant burned settlements, captured people, churches stripped, and fields abandoned. For kings, the threat was also political. A ruler who could not protect his people could not demand deep loyalty. In 955, near the Lech River outside Augsburg, Otto faced the Magyars in a battle that became one of the defining moments of his reign, the Battle of Lechfeld. The battlefield should not be treated as a clean, heroic painting. It was a place of heat, dust, horses, fear, and confusion. Warriors who had followed regional lords stood under a king whose authority had only recently survived internal rebellion. Bishops and nobles knew that defeat would not only mean military loss, it would expose the whole fragile system Otto had built. Victory at Lechfeld changed the meaning of Otto's kingship. It did not make every duke obedient overnight. It did not erase all regional rivalry. But it gave Otto the one thing medieval rulers always needed and could never fake for long: proof that God, arms, and political order appeared to stand on the same side. After Lechfeld, Otto was no longer merely a king managing quarrels among duchies. He was the defender of the Christian East. The victory turned protection into legitimacy, and legitimacy could be enlarged. Italy gave Otto the next stage. The Italian kingdom was politically unstable. rich in symbolic value and tied to the old imperial route toward Rome. Control in Italy meant more than land. It meant access to the papacy. It meant the possibility of receiving the imperial crown. It meant turning a German kingship into something larger, older, and more dangerous. Otto had already intervened in Italy in the 950s. His marriage to Adelaide, the widowed Queen of Italy, strengthened his claim and placed him inside Italian politics. This was not romance as decoration. It was dynastic strategy. Adelaide brought legitimacy, connections, and a route into a kingdom whose crown could lead toward Rome. By 962, Otto entered Rome and was crowned emperor by Pope John XII. The scene echoed Charlemagne, but it was not the same world. Charlemagne's coronation had grown from Frankish dominance and papal need in the year 800. Otto's coronation grew from the Eastern Kingdom's military consolidation, the defeat of the Magyars, intervention in Italy, and the continuing papal need for powerful protectors. The title emperor again passed through Rome, but the skeleton beneath it was now German kingship. That is why Otto's coronation is often treated as the more direct foundation of the medieval empire, later called the Holy Roman Empire. But the same contradiction returned with sharper edges. The emperor needed Rome to become more than a German king. Rome needed the emperor because papal politics could be dangerous and unstable. Each side gained from the other. Each side also created leverage against the other. Pope John XII crowned Otto, but Otto soon intervened in papal affairs and helped depose John when relations collapsed. This detail is important because it prevents the coronation from becoming a simple sacred fairy tale. The crown was holy in language, but the politics around it were hard, immediate, and often brutal. Popes used emperors. Emperors used popes. Rome gave legitimacy, but it also pulled rulers into Italian factional struggle. For Otto, the imperial title was a triumph. For the empire, it was a blueprint and a trap. The blueprint was clear. A strong German king could master the duchies, use the church as an administrative partner, defeat external enemies, enter Italy, secure papal coronation, and claim the Roman imperial title. The trap was just as clear. The emperor's greatness depended on forces he did not fully control. Dukes with their own interests, bishops whose sacred offices could become contested, Italian politics that consumed attention, and a papacy whose blessing could become accusation. This is the German skeleton of Rome. Not a resurrected ancient empire, not a modern state, not a simple continuation of Charlemagne. It was a structure built from German kingship, Christian legitimacy, military defense, episcopal administration, Italian ambition, and Roman symbolism. It was powerful because each piece reinforced the others. It was fragile because each piece could also turn against the center. A duke could rebel. A bishop could become the center of a dispute. An Italian city could resist. A pope could crown, bargain, accuse, or call for help from another power. A German king could cross the Alps seeking glory and return to find trouble at home. Otto's achievement was to make the system work in his lifetime. He gave the Eastern Kingdom a prestige it had not possessed since the Carolingian fracture. He showed that the imperial title could return through the German East. He made military protection, church partnership, and Roman coronation serve one another. But he did not solve the deeper question. If the emperor's power rested partly on bishops, who had the final right to appoint them? If the imperial crown came from Rome, how independent could the emperor truly be from the pope? If Italy was necessary for imperial dignity, how much German stability would be spent trying to control it? Those questions waited beneath the triumph of 962. For a while, the Ottonian system looked like an answer. The emperor stood above dukes, guarded the church, influenced bishops, defended Christendom, and carried Rome's name through a German monarchy. But every answer in the Holy Roman Empire carried the seed of another conflict. Otto had rebuilt the imperial frame. Later emperors would discover how heavy that frame could become. The empire's next crisis began with an object small enough to fit in a man's hand. A ring, a staff. To modern eyes, they can look like religious ornaments, symbols of a bishop's office. The ring of spiritual marriage to the church, the staff of pastoral authority. But in the 11th century, those objects carried land, courts, income, armed retainers, castles, tolls, and influence over the men who lived under episcopal rule. A bishop was not only a shepherd of souls, he could be a prince. That is why the question of who placed the ring and staff into a bishop's hands became one of the most dangerous questions in medieval Europe. For the German kings and emperors after Otto I, bishops had been essential. They were educated. They could write, judge, administer, negotiate, and hold territory. Unlike lay dukes, they did not pass their offices to legitimate sons in a normal hereditary line. That made them useful to kings who wanted power in the provinces without creating dynasties that might rival the crown. The arrangement had a practical logic. A king appointed or influenced a bishop. The bishop owed loyalty. The bishop governed church lands, supported royal policy, hosted royal courts, and helped balance the great lay nobles. The crown wrapped administration in sacred cloth, and the altar helped hold the kingdom together. But the same arrangement looked very different from Rome. To reforming churchmen, lay investiture. The practice of secular rulers investing bishops and abbots with the symbols of office was not administrative convenience, it was contamination. If a king could decide who became bishop, then sacred office could be bought, traded, rewarded, or used as political payment. The church would not be free. It would be held from inside by the hands of lay power. The conflict was not just about ceremony. It was about the skeleton of the empire. Remove royal influence over bishops, and the emperor lost one of his strongest tools for controlling the German lands. Preserve royal influence, and the papacy could accuse the emperor of corrupting the church. Each side could present itself as defending order. Each side believed the other was turning God's world upside down. By the time Henry IV became the central figure in this conflict, the empire already carried multiple pressures. Henry had been crowned king as a child. His minority had weakened royal authority and allowed powerful nobles to maneuver around the crown. In Saxony, resentment against royal castles and officials had grown especially dangerous. German princes watched the young king closely, not as servants watching a master, but as armed men measuring whether the center was strong enough to fear. Henry needed bishops. He needed them not as decoration, but as political infrastructure. A loyal bishop could anchor royal presence in a region. A hostile bishop could give moral language to resistance. In a kingdom where dukes and nobles had their own networks, the right church appointments could decide whether royal authority had reach or only ambition. Gregory was not merely a pope with personal pride. He represented a reform movement that had been gathering force for decades. The church was trying to cleanse itself of simony, clerical marriage, and secular domination. Reformers wanted the clergy separated from lay control, and the papacy increasingly claimed the authority to discipline Christian rulers, not simply advise them. In 1075, ideas associated with this papal revolution were expressed with hard clarity in the Dictatus Papae, a set of propositions asserting extraordinary papal authority. Among them was the claim that the Pope could depose emperors. Whether every line should be read as a public manifesto or internal reform statement, the political message was unmistakable. Rome was no longer content to bless imperial power from beneath it. Rome intended to stand above it. Henry IV could not accept that without weakening the monarchy itself. The confrontation sharpened over episcopal appointments, especially in northern Italy and the Archbishopric of Milan. Milan mattered because it was not only a religious post, it was a great urban and political center in a region where imperial claims, papal reform, local factions, and Italian autonomy all collided. Whoever controlled such appointments controlled far more than prayers. In January 1076, Henry gathered German bishops at Worms. There, he and his supporters rejected Gregory's authority and called for him to step down. The language was severe. Henry treated Gregory not as a universal judge above kings, but as a man who had overreached his office and threatened the proper order of Christendom. Gregory answered with the weapon only the papacy could use at full force: excommunication. He released Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty and excluded the king from the communion of the church. This was not a private spiritual penalty. It was a political earthquake. In a world where kingship depended on sacred legitimacy, excommunication did not simply say a ruler's soul was in danger. It told every bishop, noble, rival, and rebel that obedience to him could now be questioned. It turned loyalty into a matter of conscience. It gave ambition a language of righteousness. A duke who had hated Henry yesterday could oppose him tomorrow as a defender of Christian order. A bishop unsure of the king could step back and wait. A rebel could look less like a traitor and more like a servant of reform. This was the Pope's weapon. Not an army marching across the Alps, but the ability to change what obedience meant. Henry's German enemies understood the opportunity. The princes did not rush to save him simply because he was king. They demanded that he resolve the crisis with the Pope or risk losing the throne. A meeting was planned for Augsburg in 1077, where Gregory's presence could have helped Henry's opponents decide his fate. Henry moved before that could happen. In the winter of 1076 to 1077, he crossed the Alps to reach Gregory in northern Italy. This journey has often been remembered through the image of Henry standing barefoot in the snow outside the castle of Canossa for 3 days, begging forgiveness. The traditional picture is powerful, but it should be handled carefully. Medieval sources shaped the scene for meaning. What matters most is not whether every visual detail happened exactly as later memory imagined it. What matters is that the king had been forced to seek absolution from the Pope under pressure from his own political world. Canossa was not just humiliation. It was strategy. Henry needed to break the alliance between papal judgment and princely rebellion. If Gregory absolved him, then Henry's enemies in Germany could no longer use excommunication in the same way. The Pope would lose, at least temporarily, the sharpest edge of his political weapon. Henry's journey was therefore an act of submission and calculation at the same time. At Canossa, Gregory faced his own dilemma. As Pope, He could not easily refuse a penitent king who came seeking forgiveness. To deny absolution too openly would risk making spiritual discipline look like mere political manipulation. Yet if he absolved Henry, he weakened the German princes who had been using the excommunication to challenge the king. The castle became a trap for both men. Gregory had the authority to forgive. Henry needed forgiveness in order to fight. When Henry received absolution, the crisis did not end. It changed shape. The German princes proceeded to elect Rudolf of Rheinfelden as rival king in 1077. Civil war followed. The conflict moved through battlefields, councils, propaganda, and shifting loyalties. Henry was excommunicated again. He eventually supported an anti-pope, Clement III, and in 1084 entered Rome, where Clement crowned him emperor. Gregory fled and died in exile in 1085. Those details matter because they prevent the story from becoming a simple morality play. If one only remembers Canossa, the narrative becomes Pope defeats emperor. But the real struggle was longer, uglier, and less decisive. Henry survived. Gregory suffered defeat and exile. The papacy did not immediately control Europe. The emperor did not permanently master the church. Both sides wounded each other, and the empire's internal structure absorbed the damage. The deeper winner was not one man. The deeper winner was fragmentation. The princes had learned something important. They learned that a king's sacred legitimacy could be attacked from outside and exploited from inside. They learned that papal authority could provide moral cover for political resistance. They learned that the emperor was not untouchable if enough sacred language and local ambition moved together. The bishops also became a battlefield in themselves. Were they servants of the altar, servants of Rome, servants of the emperor, territorial lords, or all of these at once? The empire never found a simple answer because the answer changed depending on who held the advantage. For ordinary people, the controversy did not appear as a clean constitutional debate. A village might see its bishop change allegiance. A monastery might watch its abbot pulled between reform and aristocratic pressure. A town might hear that the king had been cut off from the church, then later restored, then condemned again. Soldiers might march under banners of obedience while priests argued over whether obedience itself had become sin. The empire's sacred language had become unstable. That instability was the real damage. Otto's system had relied on harmony between crown and church. Henry IV's struggle with Gregory VII showed that the harmony could become war. The same bishops who once helped tie territories to royal power now raised the question of whether royal power had any right to touch them. The same papacy that once crowned emperors now claimed the authority to judge and even depose them. The same German princes who once needed kings to defend order now saw that disorder could increase their bargaining power. In 1122, long after the first clash between Henry and Gregory, the Concordat of Worms tried to settle the investiture question. It distinguished between spiritual authority and temporal rights, allowing the church a clearer role in choosing bishops, while preserving certain imperial rights connected to lands and regalia. It was a compromise, not a clean victory, and compromises have consequences. The emperor did not lose everything. The papacy did not gain everything, but the old Ottonian certainty that the ruler could use the imperial church as a reliable instrument of monarchy had been broken. From then on, imperial authority had to move through a world where church office, princely ambition, papal reform and royal control could no longer be fused without resistance. The ring and staff had opened the wound. Canossa made everyone see it. The Holy Roman Empire survived the Investiture Controversy, but it survived as a more complicated creature. The emperor remained powerful, but not sacred in the uncontested way his ideology required. The Pope remained holy, but now visibly political. The princes remained loyal when it suited them, and watchful when it did not. That was the most dangerous outcome of all, not collapse. Precedent. Once men had seen an emperor kneel, once they had seen oaths loosened by excommunication, once they had seen rival kings elected under the shadow of papal conflict, the empire could never return to the simpler dream of a crown above all disputes. The Pope had revealed a weapon. The princes had learned how to use the wound, and the emperor had learned that the enemies outside his throne were dangerous, but the men beneath it were worse. The most dangerous lesson in politics is not that a ruler can lose, it is that everyone sees him losing. After the Investiture Controversy, the Holy Roman Empire did not fall apart. No single document split it into pieces. No pope permanently reduced the emperor into a servant. No German prince immediately replaced the crown with open anarchy. The empire continued, but it continued with a memory that could not be erased. An emperor had been excommunicated. An emperor had crossed the Alps under pressure. An emperor had sought forgiveness at Canossa. An emperor's enemies had learned that sacred language could loosen political obedience. That memory mattered because medieval power depended on expectation. A king's command was stronger when men expected others to obey it. Once enough men had seen obedience become negotiable, every command carried a new question. What will the other princes do? This was the wound left by Henry IV's struggle with Gregory VII. The wound did not bleed every day. Sometimes it closed. Sometimes emperors recovered authority. Sometimes princes cooperated, bishops served, armies gathered, and royal courts functioned. But under the surface, the relationship between emperor and territorial power had changed. The great men of the empire had learned that the crown could be pressured from multiple sides at once. By Rome, by rebellion, by rival kings, by legal custom, and by the practical problem that a ruler could not be everywhere. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 tried to settle one piece of the crisis. It did so carefully because nobody could afford a total victory. Emperor Henry V and Pope Calixtus II reached a compromise on investiture. The Church would have greater freedom in episcopal elections and spiritual investiture. The emperor would retain certain rights connected to the temporal lands and privileges attached to bishoprics. In theory, the settlement separated the sacred symbols from the secular rites. In practice, it admitted that the old fusion of crown and church had broken. Before the controversy, an emperor could treat bishops as some of the most reliable beams in the imperial structure. After Worms, those beams still existed, but they had to be handled with more caution. A bishop was still a landholder. He still mattered in politics. He still could support the crown. But the emperor could no longer pretend that episcopal office was simply an extension of royal administration. A small ceremony could now contain a constitutional argument. Who was present at the election? Was the choice free? When did the emperor grant the regalia? Which rights were spiritual, and which belonged to land, revenue, courts, and military service? Questions like these do not sound cinematic at first. They sound like parchment. But parchment can change the balance of an empire. Imagine a cathedral town after Worms. The old bishop has died. Cannons gather. Royal envoys arrive. Local nobles watch the doors. A papal-minded reformer insists that the church must choose freely. A royal officer cares less about theology than about whether the new bishop will support the king's campaign, maintain roads, pay dues, and hold a castle against a rival duke. The ritual is sacred, but every man in the room understands that the appointment will decide who controls land and loyalty. This is where imperial power began to thicken into procedure, and procedure gave room to the princes. Henry V himself revealed the problem. He had rebelled against his father, Henry IV, while presenting himself as a reforming son who would heal the empire. Once emperor, he discovered that reform did not make rule easy. He fought the papacy. He fought German princes. He struggled with Saxon resistance. He secured the Concordat, but the settlement did not restore a simple imperial command over the church. Then, in 1125, Henry V died without a legitimate male heir. That death mattered as much as any battle. The Salian dynasty ended. The imperial crown could not pass cleanly from father to son. The princes now faced the question of succession not as a technicality, but as an opportunity. If the throne was vacant, who would decide the next king? Blood mattered, but not enough. Power mattered, but not alone. Election, influence, fear, bargaining, and church approval all entered the room. The princes chose Lothar of Supplinburg, Duke of Saxony, as king. They did not choose the Hohenstaufen claimant Frederick of Swabia, nephew of Henry V, and heir to important Salian possessions. That decision was not an accident. Lothar was powerful, but he was not simply the natural dynastic continuation of the Salians. His election signaled that the princes could block an overly strong hereditary transfer and elevate a ruler whose position depended on their recognition. The empire was not yet a fixed electoral monarchy in the later formal sense, but the direction was clear. Kingship depended on being chosen by the powerful, and being chosen meant owing. Lothar's reign exposed the next layer of fragmentation. He needed support against the Hohenstaufen brothers, Frederick of Swabia and Conrad. To secure alliances, he relied on one of the greatest noble houses of the age, the Welfs. Through marriage politics and territorial arrangements, the Welf position expanded dramatically, especially under Henry the Proud, who came to hold both Bavaria and Saxony. This was the imperial problem in miniature. To defeat one overmighty faction, the king strengthened another. To secure the crown, he made bargains that created future threats. To govern the empire, he had to distribute power in ways that made the empire harder to govern. On a map, this can look like colored territories changing hands. In lived reality, it meant castles, toll stations, court rights, marriages, sworn followers, episcopal alliances, and men with armed households deciding whether royal commands served their interests. The 12th century empire was being built upward and downward at the same time. Upward, rulers continued to speak the language of Rome, church, and universal order. Downward, princes were turning scattered rights into territorial lordship. They built castles on ridges and river crossings. They collected tolls. They founded towns. They protected monasteries when protection served them and pressured them when it did not. They transformed offices into local power. A minor noble building a stone tower on a hill might seem unimportant compared with an imperial coronation. But the tower mattered. It changed the road below it. It forced merchants to negotiate. It gave armed men a base. It made local villagers look upward, not toward the distant emperor, but toward the wall that controlled the valley. If the emperor's authority arrived only occasionally, the castle's authority arrived every morning. That was how fragmentation became physical, not just in law, in stone. The rise of ministeriales also shows the texture of this world. These were unfree or semi-unfree service elites who could become knights, administrators, and castle holders under kings, bishops, and princes. They were useful because they owed service and could be promoted as instruments of lordship. For rulers, they offered a way to build administrative and military capacity. For territorial lords, they helped turn authority into local machinery. Again, the same tool could strengthen the crown or strengthen its rivals. The empire was full of such double-edged instruments. Bishops could support the emperor or resist him. Castles could defend royal peace or shelter private war. Election could prevent dynastic collapse or make every succession a negotiation. Princes could protect order or profit from weakness. This is why the period after Worms should not be treated as a pause before Frederick Barbarossa. It is the workshop in which the empire's later structure was being made. The emperor still mattered enormously, but imperial authority was increasingly something that had to be assembled for each crisis. A ruler needed family lands, church alliances, princely consent, military reputation, and Italian legitimacy. Remove one pillar, and the whole building shook. When Lothar III died in 1137, the succession problem returned. Henry the Proud, the powerful Welf duke, might have seemed a natural candidate because of his vast position. But that was exactly what made him dangerous. The princes did not want a king whose territorial base could overwhelm them. In 1138, they elected Conrad III of the Hohenstaufen house instead. The result was the great Welf-Hohenstaufen rivalry that would shape imperial politics for decades. Conrad III tried to reduce Henry the Proud's power by stripping him of duchies. This did not produce calm. It produced conflict, resentment, and the long struggle between houses whose names would become embedded in the politics of Germany and Italy. The famous later labels, Guelph and Ghibelline, would grow from this world of faction, dynastic rivalry, and competing visions of where imperial authority should stand. Here again, the emperor's weakness was not that he had no power. It was that every use of power created coalitions against him. Punish a duke and his kin become enemies. Reward a bishop and a reformer may object. Favor one house and another begins to calculate rebellion. Seek the imperial crown in Rome, and German rivals use your absence. Stay in Germany, and Italy slips from your grasp. The empire was not ungovernable, but it was never simple. It required a ruler with timing, brutality, patience, legitimacy, and luck. The best emperors learned to move through competing powers like a man crossing thin ice. Each step possible, no step safe. By the middle of the 12th century, many people inside the empire still wanted order. This is important. The princes were not cartoon villains trying to destroy the realm. Bishops wanted stability. Merchants wanted roads safe enough for trade. Towns wanted privileges protected. Lesser nobles wanted patrons. Monasteries wanted charters confirmed. Even great dukes often needed the king to arbitrate disputes and legitimize their holdings. But wanting order did not mean wanting centralization. That distinction is one of the keys to the Holy Roman Empire. The princes wanted an emperor strong enough to defend the empire, honor rights, punish enemies, and preserve status. They did not want an emperor strong enough to make them irrelevant, so the crown lived inside a narrow corridor. Too weak, and it invited rebellion. Too strong, and it united resistance. The art of imperial rule was not domination. It was controlled imbalance. The Investiture Controversy had shown that sacred legitimacy could be broken. The end of the Salian line had shown that succession could be redirected. Lothair's election had shown that princes could choose against dynastic momentum. The Welf-Hohenstaufen rivalry had shown that every settlement produced a new factional map. Castles and local lordship had shown that power was becoming territorial, physical, and harder to recall into a single center. By the time Frederick Barbarossa emerged, the empire needed more than a king. It needed someone who could make the imperial idea feel dangerous again. Barbarossa would try. He would take the old language of Rome, law, honor, and sacred monarchy, and push it back into the world with steel. He would face the German princes, the papacy, and the wealthy cities of northern Italy. He would become one of the most legendary emperors of the Middle Ages. But he inherited a truth no legend could erase. The princes had seen the emperor bleed. And once men have seen blood on a crown, they never look at gold the same way again. Frederick Barbarossa did not inherit a quiet empire. He inherited a throne surrounded by men who had learned how to bargain with it. By 1152, when Frederick of Hohenstaufen was elected king, the German lands had been shaped by decades of rivalry, disputed succession, princely calculation, and the long shadow of the Investiture Controversy. The crown still carried immense prestige, but prestige was not the same as obedience. A ruler could be honored in ceremony and resisted in practice. He could be called king by men who had no intention of letting him become too strong. Barbarossa understood the problem clearly. He did not want to rule as a ceremonial figure trapped among dukes. He wanted to restore the dignity of the empire, not only as memory, but as functioning power. In him, the imperial idea found one of its most forceful medieval champions. Red-bearded, politically patient when needed, hard when challenged, skilled enough to reconcile factions in Germany, and ambitious enough to look south toward Italy with the old hunger of Roman emperors. The German princes were his first problem. The Italian cities were his second. Rome was the prize above them both. Barbarossa's early strength came partly from his position between rival houses. His father was Hohenstaufen. His mother came from the Welf family. That mattered. The conflict between Welfs and Hohenstaufen had damaged the empire after Lothar III and Conrad III. Frederick could present himself as a bridge. Not neutral, but acceptable enough to enough men. A king in the Holy Roman Empire rarely ruled because everyone loved him. He ruled because the most dangerous people decided, for the moment, that supporting him served them better than opposing him. One of Barbarossa's most important early acts was to settle the position of Henry the Lion, the powerful Welf prince. Henry eventually received both Saxony and Bavaria, making him one of the greatest lords in the empire. This settlement helped Barbarossa stabilize Germany, but it also revealed the basic cost of rule. To secure peace with a prince, the emperor made that prince stronger. Again, the empire forced its ruler to buy unity with future risk. Once Germany was manageable enough, Barbarossa turned toward Italy. Italy was not a single obedient province waiting for an emperor. Northern Italy had changed. Its cities had grown wealthy through trade, craft production, banking, law, and local government. Milan, Cremona, Piacenza, Brescia, Verona, Pavia, and others were not villages under passive lords. They were fortified political communities, proud of their customs, jealous of their autonomy, and rich enough to hire soldiers, build walls, and resist interference. For Barbarossa, this was intolerable, not because he hated cities by nature, but because their autonomy challenged the imperial claim. If the emperor was truly Roman, if imperial rights were real, then the regalia, tolls, coinage, market rights, roads, public authority, not simply be taken by communes and treated as local property. The language of empire had to become revenue, jurisdiction, obedience. That was the heart of the Italian trap. Italy gave the emperor the path to Rome and the highest symbolic legitimacy. But Italy also contained cities strong enough to drain his armies, delay his campaigns, and make every imperial victory temporary. In 1154, Barbarossa crossed the Alps for his first Italian expedition. The journey itself was a political act. German kings did not become full emperors by staying north of the mountains. They had to descend into the old Roman landscape, face Italian politics, and receive the imperial crown from the Pope. Each crossing announced that the ruler was more than a German king. But each crossing also pulled him away from Germany. The roads south were difficult. Armies needed food, animals, money, and cooperation from local powers. Alpine passes did not care about imperial ideology. A commander could speak of Rome in grand language, while his men worried about mud, spoiled grain, lame horses, and hostile towns shutting their gates. In 1155, Barbarossa was crowned emperor in Rome by Pope Adrian IV. The ceremony gave him what Otto had received before him, the sacred height of imperial dignity. But Rome was no peaceful altar. The city itself had its own politics, including the republican movement associated with Arnold of Brescia, who challenged papal temporal power and criticized clerical wealth. Barbarossa cooperated with the Pope against Arnold, who was captured and executed. The imperial crown had again been received inside a storm of local conflict. This is one of the great patterns of the empire. Every sacred achievement came attached to a practical problem. Barbarossa became emperor, but the question remained. Could he make imperial rights real in northern Italy? He tried to answer at Roncaglia. In 1158, at the Diet of Roncaglia, Barbarossa gathered legal experts, bishops, nobles, and representatives in an effort to define and reclaim imperial regalia in the Italian kingdom. Roman law, especially as studied at Bologna, helped give his claims an intellectual weapon. The emperor was not merely demanding obedience because he had soldiers. He was asserting a legal vision of public authority. The rights of roads, rivers, tolls, coinage, courts, and appointments belonged to imperial power. On parchment, Roncaglia strengthened the emperor. In the cities, it sounded like an invasion of daily life. A Milanese merchant did not experience imperial regalia as an abstract doctrine. He experienced it as the question of who controlled the road his goods traveled, who judged a dispute, who collected payment at a gate, who appointed officials, who had the right to intervene in the city's political order. A city council did not hear Roman law and think only of ancient glory. It heard the emperor reaching into its purse and walls. Milan became the central enemy. Barbarossa besieged it. The struggle was not brief. Milan's resistance symbolized the larger refusal of communes to be reduced to imperial instruments. In 1162, after a long conflict, Milan surrendered. Barbarossa ordered severe punishment. The city's walls were destroyed, its population forced out, and its political pride publicly broken. For the emperor, the destruction of Milan was meant to teach obedience. For the Italian cities, it taught fear, and fear can unify enemies. The more Barbarossa tried to impose imperial control, the more the cities learned that isolated resistance could fail. If Milan could be crushed, others might be next. Urban rivalry did not disappear. Italian communes often hated each other as much as they feared the emperor. But imperial pressure created conditions for alliance. At the same time, the papal relationship deteriorated. After Adrian IV died in 1159, a disputed papal election split Christendom. Alexander III became the pope recognized by many, but Barbarossa supported rival claimants, beginning with Victor IV. This was not a minor church quarrel. It reopened the old wound between empire and papacy. If the emperor could decide which pope was legitimate, papal independence was threatened. If the pope could organize resistance to the emperor, imperial authority in Italy was endangered. The old conflict had changed costume but not disappeared. Imperial rights, urban autonomy, and papal legitimacy fused into one crisis. In 1167, the Lombard League formed, bringing together northern Italian cities in resistance to Barbarossa. The League was not a modern nationalist movement. It was a defensive alliance of communes protecting local liberties, legal customs, and political survival. Its power lay in the practical reality Barbarossa could not erase. Cities with walls, money, militias, and shared fear could outlast imperial expeditions. That same year, Barbarossa reached Rome and seemed for a moment victorious. His forces entered the city. His antipope performed imperial rituals. The old dream looked close. Emperor in Rome, Pope humbled, Italy forced back into obedience. Then disease struck. A devastating epidemic swept through the imperial army. Men died not because they lacked courage, but because heat, sickness, overcrowding, and environment did what enemy swords had not done. Great nobles perished. The campaign collapsed. Barbarossa had to retreat north through hostile territory. His imperial triumph turned into a desperate escape. This was the Italian trap in its cruelest form. Even victory could become defeat before it could be converted into rule. In Germany, Barbarossa rebuilt. He was not finished. One reason he remains such a formidable figure is that he did not break after one disaster. He returned to Italian affairs with patience, diplomacy, and force. But the balance had changed. The Lombard League endured. Alexander III remained a serious opponent. The cities had learned to cooperate. Imperial authority now faced an organized system of resistance. The decisive military humiliation came at Legnano in 1176. Barbarossa's forces met the Lombard League, and the emperor was defeated. Medieval battle accounts often gather legend around them, and Legnano later became a symbol far beyond its immediate context. But for Barbarossa's political reality, the meaning was sharp enough. He could not simply break the communes by force. A ruler can lose a battle and still survive, but he cannot ignore what the battle proves. After Legnano, Barbarossa moved toward settlement. In 1177, at Venice, he reconciled with Pope Alexander III. The scene carried enormous symbolic weight. The emperor who had backed anti-popes now recognized the pope he had fought. It was not Canossa repeated exactly, but it belonged to the same family of imperial lessons. The emperor could challenge Rome, but he could not easily erase it. Then came the Peace of Constance in 1183. This settlement with the Lombard League gave the emperor formal recognition while allowing the cities substantial practical autonomy. They acknowledged imperial authority, but retained many of the rights they had fought to protect. Like so many imperial compromises, it could be described as a victory. Depending on where one looked, on paper, the emperor remained overlord. On the ground, the cities had survived. That distinction is everything. Barbarossa did not fail because he was weak. He failed to fully dominate Italy because the structure of power there had become too dense for imperial ideology alone. Wealthy communes, legal sophistication, papal diplomacy, local militias, factional politics, geography, disease, and the emperor's need to keep Germany stable all worked against a permanent solution. He could win obedience for a season. He could not make Italy simple. Meanwhile, the German side of the empire carried its own tension. Henry the Lion, once central to Barbarossa's stabilization, became too powerful and insufficiently cooperative. When Henry refused support for Barbarossa's Italian campaigns, his position became vulnerable. In 1180, after legal proceedings and political maneuvering, Henry was stripped of his duchies. Saxony and Bavaria were divided and redistributed. This was Barbarossa acting with imperial force at home. But even here, the result was double-edged. Henry the Lion was humbled, but the redistribution of his lands strengthened other princes and changed the territorial map. The emperor could punish an overmighty duke, yet he still had to rule by reallocating power among other lords. The empire could discipline rebellion, but it could not abolish the princely system that made rebellion possible. Barbarossa's reign therefore shows the Holy Roman Empire at one of its most dramatic high points. A strong emperor, a revived legal language of Roman authority, campaigns across the Alps, conflict with popes, cities burned and rebuilt, princes humbled, a ruler powerful enough to become legend. And still the deeper structure did not bend into central monarchy. That is the key. Barbarossa made the imperial idea dangerous again, but danger was not the same as permanent control. He could compel, negotiate, punish, and symbolize. He could not turn the empire into France. He could not make northern Italian communes into obedient provincial towns. He could not make the papacy into a stable imperial department. He could not make German princes forget their rights once he needed their soldiers again. In 1189, Barbarossa joined the Third Crusade. The old emperor, by then a figure of immense prestige, took the cross and marched east after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187. It was a final transformation of his image. Not only emperor of Roman law and German kingship, but warrior of Christendom. For a ruler whose life had been spent binding sacred language to political force, Crusade offered one last stage where those elements could meet. He never reached Jerusalem. In 1190, in Anatolia, Barbarossa drowned in the Salef River. The exact circumstances were remembered in different ways, but the political effect was clear. The emperor who had tried to make imperial dignity tangible died far from Germany, far from Rome, far from the Italian cities he had struggled to master. His death helped turn him from ruler into myth. Later legend imagined Barbarossa sleeping in a mountain, waiting to return when Germany needed him. The myth is not history in the literal sense, but it reveals something true about memory. People do not place ordinary kings inside mountains. They do that to rulers who come to represent an unfinished promise. Barbarossa's promise was imperial restoration. His reign proved both the strength and the limit of that promise. He showed that the Holy Roman Emperor could still terrify Europe. He showed that law, war, coronation, and charisma could revive the grandeur of the office. He showed that princes could be managed, cities punished, popes challenged, and Rome approached as more than a ruin. But he also showed that the empire's enemies were not only external, they were built into the job. To be emperor, he needed Rome. To reach Rome, he needed Italy. To control Italy, he needed German support. To secure German support, he had to bargain with princes. To fight the Pope, he needed church legitimacy. To claim universal authority, he had to survive local realities that did not care about universal language. That was the Italian trap. Barbarossa entered it with more force than almost anyone before him. He escaped it with legend, but not with victory complete enough to save the empire from its next contradiction. Because after Barbarossa came a ruler even more brilliant, more unsettling, and more dangerous to the system that crowned him. Frederick II would not merely fight the rules of the empire. He would make everyone wonder whether the empire could survive a genius on its throne. Frederick II was born inside a political inheritance too large for a child. In 1194, the year he entered the world, his father Henry VI stood at the peak of Hohenstaufen ambition. Henry was the son of Frederick Barbarossa, King of the Romans, Holy Roman Emperor, and through marriage to Constance of Sicily, connected to one of the richest and most strategically important kingdoms in the Mediterranean. The child born from that union carried two dangerous possibilities in one body. From his father, he inherited the imperial claim. From his mother, he inherited Sicily. That combination frightened the papacy before Frederick was old enough to understand why. Sicily was not just another kingdom. It sat in the central Mediterranean, close to North Africa, close to southern Italy, close to the Papal States, close to the roots of trade and crusade. It had been shaped by Norman rulers, Greek administrators, Latin nobles, Muslim communities, Arabic learning, and a tradition of royal government stronger and more centralized than anything the German lands could easily offer. Whoever controlled Sicily did not merely own an island and southern kingdom. He held a disciplined base of taxation, law, ports, grain, and administration directly south of Rome. For a pope, that was a nightmare if the same man also became emperor. The papacies had spent generations trying to prevent any secular ruler from surrounding it. A German emperor who controlled the north and an imperial kingdom in Sicily controlling the south could make the pope feel trapped between two jaws. This was the fear Frederick carried from birth, long before he made any decision of his own. Then death changed everything. Henry VI died in 1197. Constance died in 1198. Frederick was still a small child. The great Hohenstaufen project collapsed into uncertainty. In Germany, rival claimants fought for the crown. In Sicily, the child king became vulnerable to factions, nobles, papal guardianship, and the instability that always follows when a throne is held by a minor. Pope Innocent III became Frederick's guardian in a broad political sense. That fact is essential. Frederick's later war with the papacy was not simply a clash between strangers. The papacy helped protect his Sicilian inheritance when he was weak, but it also hoped to control the danger he represented. Innocent wanted Frederick useful, legitimate, and limited. Frederick would not remain limited. His childhood in Palermo has often been turned into legend, and some legends exaggerate. But the setting itself was real enough to matter. Sicily was a crossroads. Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Norman influences had left marks on court life, administration, architecture, and intellectual culture. A young ruler growing up there did not see Christendom as a narrow northern world of castles and bishops alone. He inherited a kingdom where royal government could be written, taxed, recorded, argued, and enforced with unusual intensity. Imagine a clerk in Palermo sharpening a reed pen beside Latin charters and Arabic accounts, while petitions move through offices and ships enter the harbor below. Outside the palace, markets carry languages that would sound foreign in many German towns. This was not the loose territorial politics of Saxony or Bavaria. It was a royal laboratory. Frederick learned power there. Not merely the power of a sword, but the power of records, officials, law, money, and controlled distance. That made him different from many emperors before him. In Germany, power had to be negotiated through princes. In Sicily, Frederick could imagine kingship as something more direct. This difference shaped his whole reign. He did not abandon the imperial dream, but the strongest foundation beneath him was never Germany. It was Sicily. That was his strength. It was also why the papacy feared him. The German throne after Henry VI did not pass smoothly. The empire entered a struggle between Philip of Swabia, Frederick's Hohenstaufen uncle, and Otto of Brunswick from the Welf side. The papacy maneuvered between the rival powers. Philip was murdered in 1208. Otto IV became emperor, but his ambitions in Italy and Sicily soon alarmed Pope Innocent III, who turned against him. Frederick then became useful. In 1212, the young Sicilian king crossed into Germany to claim the kingship against Otto. This was not a romantic adventure of destiny alone. It was a political gamble supported by papal calculation, Hohenstaufen loyalty, and princely dissatisfaction with Otto. Frederick promised, as rulers often promised, that Sicily and the empire would remain separate enough not to threaten the church. Promises are easiest when power has not yet fully arrived. By 1215, Frederick had secured recognition as King of the Romans. In 1220, Pope Honorius III crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. The papacy had helped raise the very man it had feared because the alternatives had looked worse. That pattern would repeat throughout Frederick's life. Popes needed him, then feared him. Princes accepted him, then resisted him. Cities negotiated with him, then fought him. The emperor's power was not constant, but his potential was always enormous enough to alarm every institution around him. Frederick's early imperial position included a crusading obligation. He promised to go east, to recover Jerusalem, or at least advance the crusading cause. But delays followed. Illness, politics, and calculation slowed him. To the papacy, delay looked like betrayal. To Frederick, timing mattered because leaving Europe at the wrong moment could ruin the base of his power. In 1227, Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him after Frederick set out on crusade, but turned back because of illness. The next year, Frederick sailed anyway, while excommunicated. That was already astonishing. A crusade led by a man cut off from the church challenged the entire symbolic order. Crusading was supposed to be the highest expression of Christian warfare under sacred authorization. Frederick turned it into diplomacy, conducted under papal condemnation. In 1229, during what is known as the Sixth Crusade, he negotiated with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil and secured the return of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control by treaty. He entered Jerusalem and effectively crowned himself in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, since no priest would crown an excommunicated emperor in the usual way. Militarily, the result was remarkable because he achieved by negotiation what many armies had failed to achieve by blood. Symbolically, it was intolerable. A condemned emperor had obtained Jerusalem without papal approval. This was Frederick at his most dangerous. Successful in a way that undermined the people who claimed the right to define success. Gregory IX could not easily celebrate him. If the Pope praised Frederick, he rewarded disobedience. If he condemned him, he appeared to reject the recovery of holy places. The emperor had placed the papacy in a trap made of results. Frederick returned to Europe not as a humbled sinner, but as a ruler who had shown that papal approval was not always necessary for political victory. The conflict did not end. It deepened. In Sicily, Frederick built one of the most impressive royal governments of the medieval world. The constitutions of Melfi, issued in 1231, reveal the logic of his rule. Law, royal courts, officials, taxation, control of violence, and the limitation of private noble power all served a stronger monarchy. The king was not merely first among local lords. In Sicily, Frederick wanted authority to flow from the crown. To a Sicilian noble who had grown used to local privileges, this meant pressure. To a royal judge, it meant written procedure. To a tax collector, it meant sharper access to resources. To the papacy, watching from the north, it meant the emperor had a real state beneath him. That mattered because the Holy Roman Empire north of the Alps did not work that way. Frederick could not transform Germany into Sicily. He was absent too often, dependent on princes, and forced to grant privileges. In 1220, before becoming emperor, he issued concessions to ecclesiastical princes. In 1232, the Statutum in Favorem Principum confirmed extensive rights for secular princes. These grants were not signs that Frederick had no ambition. They were the price of keeping Germany manageable while he concentrated on Italy and Sicily. Here was the contradiction of his rule. In Sicily, Frederick centralized. In Germany, he conceded. In Italy, he fought. No emperor could be equally strong everywhere. That unevenness shaped his fate. Frederick's own son, Henry, whom he had made king of the Romans, eventually rebelled in Germany. Henry allied with some princes and acted against his father's interests. In 1235, Frederick came north, defeated the rebellion, and imprisoned his son. The event was not just family tragedy. It showed how difficult it was for an emperor based in Sicily to control German politics through delegated authority. Even blood could become a rival center. Frederick then tried to restore imperial prestige with renewed force. Northern Italy again became the central battlefield. The Lombard cities, especially those connected through the revived Lombard League, feared imperial domination just as they had under Barbarossa. They knew what imperial rights could mean when enforced. Lost autonomy, royal officials, financial burdens, and the reduction of communal government. Frederick wanted more than symbolic recognition. The cities wanted survival. In 1237, at the Battle of Cortenuova, Frederick won a major victory over the Lombard League. The triumph was real. Captured Carroccio, prisoners, banners, and the shock of defeat gave the emperor a moment of intimidating prestige. For a time, it seemed possible that Frederick might succeed where Barbarossa had only partially succeeded. But victory created its own danger. Instead of accepting a moderate settlement that might have preserved his gains, Frederick pushed for harsher submission. The cities resisted. Milan did not collapse into obedience. The papacy grew more alarmed. What had been an imperial campaign against rebellious communes began to look from Rome like the construction of a Hohenstaufen domination across Italy. Gregory IX excommunicated Frederick again in 1239. The conflict became total in language. Papal propaganda painted Frederick as a monster of pride, impiety, and near-apocalyptic danger. Imperial propaganda answered with accusations against clerical corruption and papal interference. Letters, sermons, councils, envoys, and legal arguments became weapons alongside sieges and armies. Frederick's court intensified the fear because it did not fit the image many churchmen wanted from a Christian emperor. He patronized scholars. He corresponded on scientific and philosophical questions. He wrote or sponsored work connected to falconry, most famously the treatise associated with him, De Arte Venandi Cum Avibus. He employed Muslims in his Sicilian forces and administration. His court culture appeared curious, multilingual, disciplined, and unsettling. One must be careful here. Frederick was not a modern secular ruler accidentally born in the Middle Ages. That is too neat and too flattering. He was a medieval monarch, ruthless when necessary, deeply concerned with royal authority, and fully embedded in dynastic and religious politics. But he was unusual enough that enemies could portray his unusualness as danger. In a sacred empire, difference could become evidence. The papacy did not fear Frederick because he read books. It feared him because his intelligence served a political structure that might surround and dominate Rome. When Innocent IV became pope, the conflict sharpened further. In 1245, at the Council of Lyon, Innocent declared Frederick deposed. The act was extraordinary. The Pope publicly asserted judgment over the emperor himself. Again, the issue was not merely personal hatred. It was the old question, returned in a new and harsher form. Who had final authority in Christendom? The emperor who claimed Roman universal power, or the Pope who claimed the right to judge Christian rulers? Frederick rejected the deposition, of course. He continued fighting. His son Enzo was active in Italian warfare. His loyalists still controlled important positions. Imperial power did not vanish because a council declared it gone. But the deposition gave Frederick's enemies language, legitimacy, and organization. Rival kings were promoted in Germany. Italian resistance continued. The empire's conflict became a long war of exhaustion, and exhaustion is one of the least theatrical but most decisive forces in history. Armies cost money, sieges consume time, allies demand rewards, cities rebuild defenses, princes wait for advantage, sons die, rebel, or become bargaining pieces. Messages cross the Alps too slowly. A ruler can be brilliant and still be trapped by distance, weather, debt, and the number of enemies his success has created. That is what happened to Frederick. He had too many fronts. Sicily remained his base, but also required control. Germany could not be held tightly without concessions. Northern Italy could not be subdued without long campaigns. The papacy could not be ignored because it controlled legitimacy and diplomacy. Every victory made him look more dangerous. Every setback encouraged enemies to press harder. This is the paradox of Frederick II. He may have been the most capable emperor of his age, But the Holy Roman Empire was not built to tolerate an emperor who might become too capable. If he succeeded fully in Sicily, Rome felt threatened. If he succeeded in Italy, the communes united. If he tried to control Germany, the princes resisted. If he ignored Germany, princely autonomy deepened. If he won Jerusalem without the Pope, he undermined papal authority. If he fought the Pope directly, he confirmed papal fears. Frederick's genius did not solve the system. It exposed the system. In 1250, Frederick died at Castel Fiorentino in Apulia. He did not die as a defeated nobody. He died still formidable, still surrounded by loyalists, still holding a vision of monarchy sharper than most of his enemies could comfortably accept. But his death removed the one personality capable of holding together the Hohenstaufen project. After him, the structure began to fail. His son Conrad IV inherited claims, but not the full force of his father's authority. Manfred fought for the Hohenstaufen cause in Sicily. The papacy continued its struggle against the dynasty. Eventually, Charles of Anjou would be invited into the conflict, and Hohenstaufen power in southern Italy would be destroyed. Conradin, Frederick's young grandson, would be executed in 1268 after trying to reclaim the inheritance. But even before those final disasters, something had already changed. The imperial office had passed through its most brilliant danger and emerged weaker. After Frederick II, the empire entered the Great Interregnum, a period in which central kingship became uncertain and contested. The title did not disappear. The structure did not collapse completely. But the old Hohenstaufen attempt to make empire into commanding force had failed. Princes, popes, cities, and foreign powers had all learned that no emperor, however intelligent, could master every part of the system without provoking the system to defend itself. Frederick II, therefore, stands as one of the strangest figures in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. He was not simply a hero. He was not simply a villain. He was not a man ahead of his time in the shallow sense. He was a ruler whose capacities revealed the boundaries of the world he ruled. In Sicily, he showed what centralized monarchy could look like. In Germany, he showed how much the princes could extract from an absent emperor. In Jerusalem, he showed that diplomacy could outperform crusading bloodshed. In Italy, he showed that victory over cities did not equal durable obedience. In his war with the papacy, he showed that the empire's sacred claim could never be separated from the church's power to condemn it. Barbarossa had tried to restore the empire through force, law, and legend. Frederick II tried through administration, intelligence, diplomacy, and ruthless dynastic ambition. Both men made the imperial office look magnificent. Both men proved how hard it was to make magnificence govern. And after Frederick died, the empire did not roar. It drifted. The crown remained. The idea remained. But the center had been hollowed by the very struggle to make it strong. After Frederick II died, the empire did not collapse in a single dramatic fall. It became quieter. That was more dangerous. A collapsed empire leaves ruins that everyone can see. A hollowed empire can continue to issue charters, hold elections, recognize titles, collect tolls, confirm privileges, and speak in the old language while the power behind the words drains away. After 1250, the Holy Roman Empire entered one of those strange periods where the name survived more clearly than the command. This was the Great Interregnum. The term can mislead. It suggests emptiness, as if nothing happened because no emperor stood securely at the center. But the years after Frederick II were not empty. They were crowded with claimants, bargains, local wars, papal interventions, princely expansion, city leagues, toll disputes, and legal habits that continued even when royal authority was weak. The empire did not stop moving. It moved without a stable center. Frederick's son Conrad IV inherited the Hohenstaufen claim, but inheritance was not enough. Conrad had to defend Germany, Italy, and Sicily inside a hostile political environment shaped by his father's long war with the papacy. He could not simply step into Frederick's place. The Hohenstaufen name carried prestige, but it also carried enemy. To the papacy, the dynasty remained a threat. To German princes, a strong Hohenstaufen restoration might mean renewed pressure. To Italian cities, it meant the return of imperial claims they had fought for generations. Conrad died in 1254. His death deepened the uncertainty. His young son Conradin existed as a dynastic hope, but a child could not rebuild imperial power across the Alps. In Sicily, Frederick's illegitimate son Manfred tried to hold the Hohenstaufen position. In Germany, the crown became increasingly separated from effective command. The imperial office remained desirable, but the men who pursued it often lacked the territorial base, money, or universal recognition to make the title bite. This is when the princes learned another lesson. A weak king could be useful, not useless. Useful. A weak king could confirm privileges without threatening to reverse them later. A weak king could grant rights, recognize lands, approve tolls, and give legal cover to arrangements already made by force. A weak king could be distant enough not to interfere, but legitimate enough to make local power look lawful. That is one of the coldest truths of the interregnum. Disorder did not always feel like disaster to the strongest men inside it. For a prince expanding his territorial court, weak monarchy created room. For a bishop defending lands, it created danger and opportunity. For a city seeking privileges, it created a market for charters. For a robber knight controlling a road, it created profit. For a merchant trying to cross 3 jurisdictions with cloth, salt, wine, or metal goods, it could mean delays, tolls, armed escorts, and the constant question of whose peace actually applied on the next stretch of road. The royal road became a negotiation. A trader leaving Mainz toward the east might pass river tolls, episcopal lands, noble castles, free cities, and territories where written privilege mattered only if armed men respected it. The empire still had law. It had too much law, perhaps. Old royal rights, local customs, ecclesiastical jurisdictions, city charters, princely claims, and immunities layered on top of one another. But law without a reliable enforcer could become a map of arguments. This was not anarchy in the simple sense. It was fragmentation thickened into daily life. One of the clearest signs of this world was the rise of leagues and local peace arrangements. In 1254, the Rhenish League formed among cities and princes along the Rhine, aiming to protect trade, enforce peace, and resist disorder. Its existence tells us something important. People inside the empire did not simply accept chaos. Cities and regional powers tried to create order when the king could not. That is the art of surviving without a center. If the emperor cannot keep the roads safe, the cities make a league. If royal justice is distant, local courts become more important. If the crown cannot impose peace, princes impose their own. If no single authority can dominate, many smaller authorities learn to coexist, compete, and bargain. This made the empire weaker as a monarchy, but harder to destroy as a framework. A fully centralized state can suffer when the center fails. The Holy Roman Empire, by contrast, had so many centers that weakness at the top did not stop political life below. Bishops still governed, dukes still held courts, town councils still collected money, monasteries still defended exemptions, princes still married, inherited, and fought. Charters still mattered, seals still traveled. The empire was becoming less like a body with one heart and more like a landscape of organs working unevenly on their own. That condition could sustain life. It could not produce unity. The kings of the interregnum show the problem clearly. William of Holland had been elected in opposition to Frederick II and his son Conrad, supported by papal and anti-Hohenstaufen forces. But William never became the unquestioned master of the empire. His authority remained limited, contested, and regionally uneven. When he died in 1256, the succession opened again. The following election produced one of the most revealing absurdities in imperial history. Some electors chose Richard of Cornwall, brother of the English king Henry III. Others chose Alfonso X of Castile. Both men had royal blood, money, prestige, and international connections. Neither could turn the German kingdom into a functioning command structure. Richard traveled to Germany and was crowned at Aachen in 1257, but his influence depended heavily on payments, alliances, and visits. Alfonso, despite his claim and title, never even came to Germany to rule in person. This was kingship as a legal and diplomatic prize, not kingship as daily government. The throne had become attractive to men outside the core of the empire because the title still had shine. But shine was not structure. The electors could sell, divide, and manipulate recognition. Because the crown's power had become negotiable, their role was not yet fully formalized as it would be in the Golden Bull of 1356. But the pattern was unmistakable. The men who chose the king were becoming more important than the king they chose. The empire was learning to live as an elective system before it had fully admitted what that meant. The Hohenstaufen disaster continued in Italy. Manfred ruled in Sicily, but papal hostility remained relentless. The popes looked for a power strong enough to destroy the dynasty in the south. They eventually turned to Charles of Anjou, brother of the French king Louis IX. In 1266, Manfred was defeated and killed at the Battle of Benevento. In 1268, young Conradin, Frederick II's grandson, attempted to reclaim the inheritance but was defeated at Tagliacozzo and executed in Naples. That execution closed a chapter with brutal clarity. The Hohenstaufen line that had produced Barbarossa and Frederick II was broken. For the empire, the consequences were immense. The dynasty that had most fiercely tried to make the imperial title a commanding force was gone. The papacy had helped destroy its southern enemy, but it had also contributed to a political world in which imperial central authority remained damaged. The princes in Germany had little desire to revive a monarchy strong enough to dominate them. The Italian communes had learned to survive imperial pressure. The crown remained, but the dynastic engine behind it had failed. By the 1270s, exhaustion created a new need. The princes did not want another Frederick II, but they also did not want endless uncertainty. Too much disorder endangered trade, inheritance, justice, and the credibility of the very privileges they wanted confirmed. A king who was too strong could threaten them. A kingship too weak could make the entire legal order look cheap. They needed someone acceptable. not overwhelming. Acceptable. In 1273, the princes elected Rudolf of Habsburg as King of the Romans. This choice was one of the great quiet turning points in the history of Central Europe. Rudolf was not the most glamorous candidate. He did not possess a vast imperial inheritance like the Hohenstaufen at their height. That was part of the appeal. He was strong enough to restore some order, but not so strong that the electors expected immediate domination. His election marked the end of the great interregnum in the usual historical sense, but it did not restore the old empire of Frederick II. It confirmed a new reality. The princes would choose a king they could live with. Rudolf's reign showed what post-interregnum kingship would look like. He concentrated on restoring royal rights where possible. But his most lasting success came from dynastic acquisition. After defeating Ottokar II of Bohemia, Rudolf secured Austria and Styria for his family, laying the foundation for Habsburg power. The imperial office helped him build a dynasty, but the dynasty would increasingly become its own project. That, too, was a consequence of the interregnum. If the emperor could not easily dominate the empire as a whole, he could use the kingship to strengthen his own house. The center had not disappeared. It had changed incentives. Princes wanted privileges confirmed. Kings wanted family lands. Cities wanted protection. Bishops wanted their rights recognized. Everyone invoked the empire, but not everyone wanted the same empire. For some, it was a sacred inheritance. For others, a legal framework. For others, a ladder. For others, a shield. The great interregnum stripped away the illusion that the Holy Roman Empire depended on one commanding ruler at all times. It revealed something stranger. The empire could survive central weakness because so much of its life had already moved into local and regional institutions. That survival was impressive. It was also costly. A realm that survives without a center may forget how to obey one. By the end of the interregnum, the empire had gained a habit it would never fully lose. Its princes expected consultation. Its electors expected influence. Its cities expected negotiated privilege. Its bishops expected complex rights. Its kings learned that imperial ambition required bargaining before action. This was not the death of the empire. It was the birth of its mature weakness, and mature weakness can last a very long time. The Holy Roman Empire after 1273 was no longer the world of Charlemagne's single will, Otto's military sacred consolidation, Barbarossa's Italian thunder, or Frederick II's brilliant menace. It was becoming a constitutional landscape before anyone designed it cleanly. A system of powers, rights, titles, courts, votes, claims, and compromises. That system needed a clearer rule for one thing above all: election. Who had the right to choose the king? How could disputed elections be contained? How could the empire prevent every succession from becoming a market, a war, or an invitation to foreign claimants? The answer would come in 1356, under Charles IV, in a document sealed with gold. The Golden Bull would not end fragmentation. It would give fragmentation a constitution. The Holy Roman Empire did not solve its weakness in 1356. It named it. For more than a century after Frederick II, the empire had lived with a dangerous question at its center. Who had the right to choose the king? The answer had never been completely absent. Great princes, bishops, and magnates had long played a role in royal elections, but practice was not the same as certainty, and uncertainty was expensive. Uncertainty meant disputed elections. Uncertainty meant rival claimants. Uncertainty meant foreign candidates buying support with promises. Uncertainty meant that every vacancy could become a market, a battlefield, or both. By the 14th century, the empire had become highly skilled at survival. It could function through princes, bishops, cities, courts, charters, local privileges, and regional power. But the royal election remained too dangerous to leave vague. If the emperor was too weak, the empire drifted. If the emperor was too strong, the princes resisted. If the election was contested, everyone could claim legality while preparing for war. Charles IV understood this world better than most rulers. He was not a Barbarossa trying to conquer Italy into obedience. He was not Frederick II trying to build a Mediterranean imperial monarchy. Charles was from the House of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia, and one of the most politically intelligent rulers of the later medieval empire. He knew that the empire could not be restored by pretending the princes were merely subjects. They were not. They were pillars, rivals, electors, landlords, judges, churchmen, and regional powers whose cooperation had to be structured. Charles did not try to destroy fragmentation. He tried to discipline it. That is the key to the Golden Bull of 1356. It was not a romantic document. It did not make the empire democratic. It did not create national unity. It did not give ordinary people a political voice. It was a high-level settlement among the empire's most powerful men designed to reduce electoral chaos by defining who mattered most. The document was issued in stages, first at the imperial diet in Nuremberg and then at Metz. Its golden seal gave it the name by which history remembers it, the Golden Bull. The seal mattered because medieval politics was intensely visual and material. Authority did not travel only through ideas. It traveled through wax, metal, parchment, formula, witness, rank, and ritual. A sealed document could tell princes what armies had failed to settle permanently. There would be 7 prince-electors. 3 were ecclesiastical, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. 4 were secular, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. This list was not random. It reflected older electoral practice, political weight, regional prestige, and Charles's own interests. As King of Bohemia, Charles himself belonged to the Electoral College. The document stabilized the system, but it also confirmed the status of those already powerful enough to shape it. That was the cold genius of the settlement. The empire would avoid endless arguments over who could elect the king by recognizing a small group of men whose rights stood above the rest. Peace through exclusion, order through hierarchy. The Golden Bull specified that the electors should gather at Frankfurt after a king's death. The Archbishop of Mainz had the duty to summon them. If an elector could not appear, he could send envoys. The election would be decided by majority vote rather than requiring impossible unanimity. After election, the chosen king would traditionally proceed toward coronation at Aachen, the city of Charlemagne's memory. The procedure looks technical. It was explosive. Majority rule meant that dissenting electors could be overridden. A candidate did not need to satisfy everyone. He needed enough of the 7. This reduced the chance that one holdout could paralyze the empire, but it also made bargaining among electors even more valuable. Every vote became a political asset. Every elector became not only a prince, but a gatekeeper of imperial legitimacy. Imagine Frankfurt during an election season, not as an abstract constitutional chamber, but as a city under pressure. Envoys arrive with sealed letters. Armed escorts wait outside walls. Clerks record claims. Servants carry trunks of documents and gifts. Bishops' men speak carefully in private houses. Representatives of secular princes measure promises against risk. The city hears rumors before it hears decisions. Who sorts whom, who has been bought, who refuses to appear, who fears a candidate too strong, who wants confirmation of old rights. The empire is being chosen, but the choice feels like negotiation under guard. This is where the Golden Bull reveals the empire's mature nature. The emperor was not the source from which all authority flowed downward. He was produced by the highest territorial powers of the empire. That did not make him meaningless. Far from it, the royal and imperial title still mattered. A king could confirm privileges, grant rights, lead campaigns, judge disputes, elevate families, and embody the imperial order. But he entered office through a door controlled by men who had every reason to keep that office limited. Charles IV accepted this because he was practical. His power was strongest in Bohemia, not through a fantasy of universal control. Prague became one of the great centers of his reign. In 1348, he founded the University of Prague, the first university in Central Europe. He built, patronized, organized, and elevated Bohemia as the core of Luxembourg power. This matters because it shows how later medieval emperors increasingly used the imperial office alongside dynastic territorial strategy. The emperor did not stop being emperor. But he also acted as a territorial ruler, building his own family base. That dual identity shaped the empire for centuries. The ruler had imperial responsibilities, but his real resources came from family lands. A king without a strong territorial base could be weak. A king with too strong a base could frighten the electors. The Golden Bull did not remove that tension. It made the rules around it more predictable. The documents also strengthened the electors themselves. Their lands and rights were protected in ways that helped preserve their political weight. Electoral territories were to remain undivided, so the voting dignity would not be broken apart through inheritance. The electors received high jurisdictional privileges and ceremonial precedence. Their position became more than custom. It became constitutional fact. Again, the empire gained stability by strengthening the very powers that limited the crown. This was not an accident. It was the deal. The prince-electors wanted a predictable empire because unpredictability endangered their rights. Charles wanted a predictable empire because disputed elections weakened kingship and invited humiliation. Both sides wanted order, but not centralization. Order meant knowing who had what right. Centralization would mean allowing the emperor to override too many rights at once. The Golden Bull gave them order without unity. That phrase captures much of the Holy Roman Empire after 1356. Order without unity. A king could be elected with clearer procedure. The electors could vet their status. Major disputes could be reduced. But the document did not create a common treasury, a permanent imperial army, or a centralized bureaucracy. It did not dissolve duchies, bishoprics, imperial cities, abbeys, and noble jurisdictions into one state. It did not answer the deeper question of how the empire could act quickly when faced with external danger or internal religious crisis. It made the machine less likely to break during succession. It did not make the machine strong. One can see the compromise in the ceremonial hierarchy itself. The electors were not merely voters. They held symbolic offices attached to the imperial household: arch-chancellor, arch-mareschalite, arch-chamberlain, and other dignities tied to the ritual imagination of empire. Ceremony transformed political privilege into sacred order. A vote was not only a vote. It was part of a cosmic theater of rank. Medieval power loved this kind of theater because theater made inequality appear natural. At a great imperial gathering, who sat where mattered, who carried which object mattered, who spoke first mattered. Which archbishop placed which hand where mattered. In such details, ambition became etiquette. Rivalry became precedence. The empire staged hierarchy so that men would not have to fight over it every time. But staging hierarchy did not eliminate rivalry. It only gave rivalry rules. The Golden Bull also revealed Charles IV's view of the cities. The 14th century empire contained powerful urban communities, especially in the Rhineland, Swabia, Franconia, and northern Italy. Cities had money, walls, militias, councils, and economic confidence. They could form leagues for defense and trade. To princes and kings, city leagues could look useful when they helped keep peace, but threatening when they acted independently. The Golden Bull took a suspicious view of unauthorized urban confederations and associations. This reflected the fear that cities might create their own collective power outside the hierarchy dominated by princes and electors. The empire needed cities, but the constitutional settlement of 1356 did not place them at the top table. The highest framework remained aristocratic and ecclesiastical. A merchant in an imperial city might care deeply about safe roads, stable coinage, and fair courts. But when the king was chosen, he did not stand among the seven. The empire's future would be decided by archbishops and territorial princes, not by the commercial forces increasingly shaping Europe's material life. That too was a limitation hidden inside the settlement. The Golden Bull was brilliant for the world it addressed. It reduced one kind of chaos. It clarified the election. It elevated the electors into a defined constitutional elite. It made future successions more manageable than the wild decades of the interregnum. But it also locked in fragmentation. The emperor would never again be able to pretend easily that the princes were simply lesser servants under a universal crown. The greatest of them were now the recognized makers of kings. Their autonomy was not a temporary weakness of the empire. It was part of the empire's legal design. This is why Charles IV should not be treated as a failed centralizer. He was something more interesting, a realist of imperial limitation. He looked at an empire too complex to be dominated and asked how it could be made governable enough to survive. His answer was not to concentrate power at the top. His answer was to define the people who could block the top and make them responsible for producing it. That answer worked. For a long time, the Golden Bull helped stabilize royal elections for centuries. It gave the empire a clearer constitutional rhythm. It helped make the electors central actors in imperial politics. It turned what had once been a dangerous contest of custom, force, and recognition into a more regularized system of elite choice. But the price was permanent. The emperor would be chosen by men who did not want to be ruled too much. The empire would survive because no single ruler could easily seize it. The empire would remain weak because no single ruler could easily command it. Here the central paradox becomes sharper than ever. The Holy Roman Empire did not endure despite its fragmentation alone. It endured because fragmentation was organized, ritualized, and legalized. The system survived by turning potential civil war into procedure. It took the danger of competing powers and placed it inside ranks, seals, votes, and ceremonies. But a structure built to manage division is not the same as a structure built to overcome it. That distinction would matter terribly in the next great crisis. For as long as the empire's conflicts remained questions of election, privilege, territory, precedence, and dynastic rivalry, the Golden Bull could help. It could tell the powerful how to choose a king. It could reduce procedural chaos. It could make the top of the empire legible. But it could not protect the empire from a crisis of belief. It could not decide what would happen if Christian unity itself broke. It could not answer what the emperor should do if princes claimed that obedience to God required disobedience to the old church. It could not contain the printing press. It could not silence a monk in Wittenberg. The Golden Bull gave fragmentation a constitution. The Reformation would give fragmentation a conscience. The Golden Bull could organize an election. It could not organize belief. For nearly 2 centuries after 1356, the Holy Roman Empire lived with a constitutional logic that was strange but workable. The emperor was chosen by electors. Princes guarded their privileges. Bishops held land and office. Imperial cities negotiated freedom. Courts, diets, seals, and charters gave form to a realm that was never simple enough to become one centralized monarchy. The system could survive disagreement because disagreement had rules. But in 1517, the empire faced a kind of conflict that no electoral procedure could contain. A monk questioned the economy of salvation. His name was Martin Luther. He was not born as a revolutionary prince, and he did not command an army. He did not rule Saxony. He did not sit among the 7 electors. He was an Augustinian friar, a professor at the University of Wittenberg, and a man shaped by confession, scripture, fear of judgment, and the heavy spiritual machinery of late medieval Christianity. That is why the crisis began in a place that seemed, at first, too small to break an empire. Wittenberg was not Rome. It was not Aachen. It was not Frankfurt during an imperial election. It was a university town in the electorate of Saxony, under the protection of Frederick the Wise. Yet that location mattered. Saxony was not just any territory. Its ruler was an elector, one of the princes whose vote helped choose the king of the Romans. Luther's ideas did not emerge in empty air. They emerged inside the political geography created by the empire itself. A local university, a territorial prince, a printing network, a papacy in need of money, an empire ruled by negotiation. That combination made a theological dispute into a constitutional fire. The immediate spark was the preaching of indulgences, especially the campaign associated with Johann Tetzel. Indulgences were tied to the Church's authority over penance and the remission of temporal punishment for sin. In practice, by the early 16th century, indulgence campaigns were also financial mechanisms. Money raised in German lands could support church projects and ecclesiastical debts, including matters connected to the rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome and the finances of high church offices. To many ordinary people, the details were not abstract theology. They were coin, confession, fear, and hope. Imagine a market square where a preacher speaks of souls, punishment, mercy, and release. A widow hears the promise of spiritual benefit for the dead. A craftsman counts the coins in his hand. A parish priest watches uneasily. A student repeats the story later in a tavern, somewhere nearby. A printer knows that controversy sells faster than sermons of routine obedience. That was the world Luther entered. On October 31, 1517, Luther sent his 95 theses to Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz. The famous image of him hammering the theses to the church door at Wittenberg may be traditional and symbolic. The more important fact is that the theses circulated. They challenged the preaching and theology of indulgences, questioned abuses, and pressed toward a deeper issue. Where did the church's authority end, and where did true repentance begin? In another century, the dispute might have stayed inside academic channels. In Luther's century, print changed the speed of danger. Pamphlets could move faster than bishops. Short texts could travel from Wittenberg to Leipzig, Nuremberg, Basel, Augsburg, and beyond. Printers did not need to understand every theological nuance to understand demand. A Latin academic dispute became a German public event. Arguments that might once have remained among scholars and church officials now entered workshops, courts, taverns, and town councils. The printing press did not create Luther's theology. It created Luther's audience. That audience mattered because the Holy Roman Empire was not a unified state with one center able to silence a controversy everywhere at once. It was a layered realm of jurisdictions. A bishop might condemn, a city council might delay, a university might debate, a printer might move, a noble might protect, an imperial command might require local enforcement by men who had their own interests. The empire's fragmentation became a shelter for dissent, not always intentionally, not always safely, but effectively. Rome responded slowly at first, then with growing alarm. Luther's challenge deepened beyond indulgences. In the Leipzig debate of 1519, arguing against Johann Eck, Luther was pushed toward positions that questioned not merely abuses, but the authority of popes and councils. The issue widened from corrupt practice to the structure of Christian authority itself. That was the moment the crisis became dangerous to the Holy Roman Empire. A complaint about indulgences could perhaps be disciplined. A challenge to papal and conciliar authority threatened the sacred framework that had supported imperial legitimacy for centuries. Remember the empire's oldest contradiction. From Charlemagne to Otto to Barbarossa, imperial power had relied on Christian universality. The emperor's title made sense inside a world where Latin Christendom could still imagine itself as one sacred order, even when popes and emperors fought within it. The battles were severe, but they assumed that one Christian truth stood above the combatants. Luther's challenge attacked that assumption from beneath. If Scripture stood above pope and council, if conscience bound by the Word of God could resist institutional command, then obedience could fracture not only politically, but spiritually. A prince might no longer oppose the emperor merely because of land or privilege. He could claim to defend the gospel. A city might not reject a bishop merely for money or jurisdiction. It could say the bishop taught false doctrine. The language of resistance became deeper than law. It became salvation. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued the bull Exsurge Domini, threatening Luther with excommunication unless he recanted condemned propositions. Luther publicly burned the bull and canon law books in Wittenberg. This was a symbolic act with political consequences. To burn the document was not simply to disagree. It was to stage refusal. The papacy answered in 1521 with formal excommunication. But excommunication alone did not end the crisis. A century earlier, papal condemnation had shaken emperors and kings because sacred legitimacy ran through Rome. But by 1521, print, territorial politics, university debate, resentment of ecclesiastical wealth, and princely interests gave condemnation a harder road. A banned idea could still be copied. A condemned monk could still be sheltered. A papal sentence still needed political enforcement. That enforcement fell into the world of Charles V. Charles was elected King of the Romans in 1519, defeating rival possibilities, including Francis I of France. He was young, Habsburg, and already ruler of a vast inheritance. Spain, Burgundian lands, Austria, territories in Italy, and expanding overseas domains. In 1520, he was crowned king in Aachen. The following year, he faced Luther at the Diet of Worms. Charles V carried one of the last great visions of universal Christian monarchy, but his empire was too large for simple control. He faced France in the west, Ottoman pressure in the east and Mediterranean, financial dependence on bankers, tensions in Spain, Italian wars, dynastic responsibilities. And now, inside the Holy Roman Empire, a theological fire spreading through German territories. In 1521, Worms became more than an imperial diet. It became a stage where the old order asked whether it could still command belief. Luther appeared before emperor, princes, churchmen, lawyers, and envoys. The famous words often attributed to him in later memory should be handled carefully, because the exact phrasing is debated. What matters historically is clearer. Luther refused to recant unless convinced by scripture and reason, and he would not submit simply because pope or council demanded it. That refusal cut through the old hierarchy. Charles V responded with the Edict of Worms, declaring Luther an outlaw and banning his writings. In theory, this should have crushed the movement. In practice, enforcement depended on the empire's political structure, and the structure did not obey as one body. Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, had Luther taken into protective custody and hidden at Wartburg Castle. Frederick did not necessarily share every implication of Luther's theology at first, but he protected the process, his university, and his territorial authority. He would not hand over his famous professor, as if Saxony were merely an administrative district of a centralized empire. At Wartburg, Luther translated the New Testament into German, published in 1522. That translation mattered because it brought scripture into a broader vernacular world. It strengthened the connection between religious reform, print culture, and German-speaking audiences. The argument was no longer contained in Latin debate. It entered households, schools, churches, and city life. A book could now cross a border faster than an imperial officer. The empire's weakness became visible in paper form. In some cities, reform ideas attracted preachers and councils. In some territories, rulers saw spiritual conviction, political opportunity, or both. Control over church property, appointment of clergy, preaching, schooling, and poor relief could move from episcopal structures toward territorial government. The Reformation did not spread only because princes were greedy, though some certainly saw material advantage. It spread because theology, politics, local grievance, and institutional opportunity reinforced one another. A prince could reform a church and strengthen his administration. A city council could adopt evangelical preaching and reduce episcopal influence. A preacher could denounce corruption and gain popular support. A printer could profit and accelerate the message. An emperor could condemn and still watch the fire move. Charles V understood the danger, but he could not devote himself fully to it. His wars with France repeatedly drew him away. The Ottoman advance, especially after Suleiman took Belgrade in 1521 and later defeated Hungary at Mohacs in 1526, created urgent pressure in the east. Rome itself was sacked in 1527 by imperial troops in a disaster that revealed how chaotic Charles's own military machine could become. No ruler, however grand his title, could solve every crisis at once. The German princes knew this. Every year that the emperor was absent or distracted allowed reform to take root more deeply. Churches changed liturgy, monasteries emptied or were restructured, clergy married, schools shifted, pamphlets multiplied. Territorial rulers discovered that religious settlement could become part of state building. The empire's legal ambiguity gave reform time to become institution. By the time Charles tried to enforce religious unity more firmly, the problem was no longer one monk. It was territories. This is the decisive transformation. Luther began as a theological rebel inside the church. The Reformation became a territorial fact inside the empire. That transformation threatened everything the Holy Roman Empire claimed to be. The emperor was supposed to protect Christendom. But which Christendom? The Pope claimed authority. Luther's followers rejected papal supremacy. Catholic princes defended old structures. Evangelical princes claimed reform. Imperial cities split. Bishops lost control in some regions and held firm in others. The empire now had not only political fragmentation, but confessional fragmentation. And confessional fragmentation was harder to manage because compromise could look like betrayal of God. The old system had been able to bargain over tolls, marriages, inheritance, and precedence. Men could negotiate land because land could be divided. They could compromise over rights because rights could be written, confirmed, and limited. But how does an empire negotiate salvation? That question turned every diet into a spiritual battlefield. At the Diet of Speyer in 1526, enforcement of the Edict of Worms was relaxed in practice, allowing territories some room to act according to their responsibility before God and emperor until a general council. In 1529, a second Diet of Speyer attempted to reverse that tolerance. Several evangelical princes and cities issued a formal protest, from which the term Protestant would later take its name. The word was born inside imperial procedure. That fact matters. Protestantism in the empire did not begin as a fully separate state outside the system. It emerged through diets, protests, legal arguments, territorial protections, and the failure of imperial authority to impose a single religious answer quickly enough. In 1530, at the Diet of Augsburg, the Lutheran estates presented the Augsburg Confession, largely written by Philip Melanchthon. It was a statement of doctrine, but also a political act. A way for evangelical princes and cities to explain themselves before the emperor without appearing as mere rebels. They wanted recognition, not simply chaos. Charles rejected permanent division, but rejection did not erase it. In 1531, Protestant princes formed the Schmalkaldic League, a defensive alliance. Once again, the empire's internal structure turned disagreement into organized power. This was not only theological argument now, it was military potential. A monk's dispute over indulgences had become a league of princes. The road from Wittenberg to war was not straight, but it was real, and every step revealed the empire's central weakness. It could contain multiple jurisdictions, but it struggled to contain multiple truths. The Reformation shattered the assumption that had made the imperial idea possible. Since 800, the empire had claimed to stand within a unified Christian order, even when popes and emperors fought to define that order. After Luther, unity itself became the question. The emperor could still be elected. The electors could still gather. The Golden Bull could still define procedure. Imperial diets could still meet. But beneath the machinery, a deeper fracture had opened. Princes no longer disagreed only over privilege. They disagreed over the path to God. That made every political settlement temporary. Charles V would spend decades trying to hold together Catholic unity, Habsburg power, imperial law, and the realities of German religious change. At times he looked close to victory. At other times he was forced back into compromise by war, money, distance, and the impossibility of fighting every enemy at once. The empire had survived without a center. It had survived fragmented law. It had survived princes strong enough to make emperors bleed. But now fragmentation had entered the altar. The Golden Bull had given division a constitution. Luther gave division a conscience. And once conscience became territorial, peace could only be bought by admitting what the old empire had never wanted to confess. Christendom was no longer one body. That admission would come in Augsburg. But it would not be peace in the true sense. It would be peace by division. Peace did not come to the Holy Roman Empire as healing. It came as admission. By the middle of the 16th century, everyone serious inside the empire understood that the Reformation was no longer a dispute that could be solved by arresting one monk or burning one book. Too much had changed. Too many territories had reorganized worship. Too many princes had attached political survival to religious reform. Too many cities had heard evangelical preaching, printed confessions, seized church property, restructured schools, and learned that theology could become government. The old dream had been simple in theory. One empire, one Christian order, one emperor defending the unity of Christendom. The reality was now harder. One empire, two recognized confessional worlds, and many rulers who would rather risk war than surrender the religion that now supported their authority. Charles V had not wanted this outcome. His whole political imagination resisted it. He was not merely a German king managing local quarrels. He was Habsburg, Catholic, universal in ambition, ruler of Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, large Italian interests, and overseas dominions. He had fought France, faced Ottoman pressure, negotiated with popes, depended on bankers, and watched Luther's movement harden from protest into territorial power. To Charles, religious division was not administrative inconvenience. It was a wound in Christendom. But even emperors have limits. By the 1540s, Charles finally tried to force a solution more directly. The Protestant princes had organized through the Schmalkaldic League, founded in 1531. The League was not simply a theological club. It was a military alliance. Its members understood that if the emperor moved against one evangelical territory, others might be next. Defense of doctrine and defense of princely autonomy had become inseparable. That fusion made the League dangerous. It also made it fragile. The Protestant side was not one seamless body. Lutheran theology, city interests, princely rivalries, and local ambitions did not always align. Some rulers feared imperial power more than they loved their confessional allies. Others calculated land, dignity, and survival. The Reformation had given fragmentation a conscience, but conscience did not remove politics. Charles knew that. In 1546, the Schmalkaldic War began. The emperor moved against the League with military force, backed by Catholic allies and helped by divisions among Protestants themselves. One of the most important figures in this drama was Maurice of Saxony. Maurice was a Lutheran prince, but he sided with Charles against his own Protestant relatives and rivals, especially John Frederick of Saxony, the Ernestine Elector. Maurice's choice shows how dangerous it is to describe the conflict as simply Catholic versus Protestant. It was also Saxon versus Saxon, dynasty versus dynasty, ambition wearing religious clothing. At the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, Charles won a major victory. John Frederick was captured. Philip of Hesse, another leading Protestant prince, submitted and was imprisoned. The emperor appeared for a moment to have done what many thought impossible: break organized Protestant military resistance. The image of Mühlberg mattered. Charles V, victorious, armored, defender of Catholic unity, seemed to stand above the empire again. Titian's famous portrait of Charles on horseback after Mühlberg captured that image of imperial triumph. Controlled, solemn, almost Roman in mood. For anyone who believed the empire still could be forced back toward unity, this was the moment to hope. But battlefield victory is not the same as governing conscience. After Mühlberg, Charles tried to impose a religious settlement through the Augsburg Interim of 1548. The interim aimed to restore many Catholic practices while allowing limited concessions such as clerical marriage and communion in both kinds in some circumstances, until a general council resolved the deeper issues. It was a compromise from the emperor's perspective. To many Protestants, it looked like defeat disguised as moderation. To many Catholics, it looked too soft. That is the problem with an imposed middle ground in a religious civil crisis. It can satisfy almost no one. A village priest ordered to restore old ceremonies might face parishioners who had heard Lutheran preaching for years. A town council might fear losing control over church property. A prince might read the interim not as theology, but as a warning that imperial authority could reach into his churches. A Catholic bishop might resent concessions made to rebels. Printers and preachers could turn every clause into controversy. The emperor had defeated an army. He had not defeated the institutional reality that army had defended. Maurice of Saxony learned quickly that his alliance with Charles had limits. Charles had rewarded him with the Saxon electoral dignity taken from John Frederick, but imperial pressure soon became uncomfortable. Maurice had gained from the emperor, yet he did not intend to become an obedient instrument of imperial religious policy. Like so many princes before him, he wanted an emperor strong enough to advance his interests, not strong enough to dominate them. In 1552, Maurice turned against Charles. This reversal shocked the imperial position. Maurice allied with other Protestant forces and even reached an understanding with Henry II of France, allowing French intervention in imperial affairs. The irony was brutal. In trying to restore unity inside the empire, Charles helped create conditions in which a German Protestant prince could cooperate with France against him. The emperor was forced to flee Innsbruck. That image breaks the triumph of Mühlberg. 5 years earlier, Charles had seemed to stand over the defeated Protestant princes. Now he was an aging emperor, exhausted by too many fronts, too many debts, too many enemies, and too much resistance from a system that never allowed victory to remain simple. The Treaty of Passau in 1552 opened the way toward a broader settlement. Protestant princes gained security, and the empire moved toward the recognition that force alone could no longer restore religious unity. Charles's brother Ferdinand, who understood German politics with practical patience, became central in negotiating what Charles himself could barely accept emotionally. The emperor's dream was dying in the hands of his own family. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg was concluded. The settlement is often remembered through the phrase cuius regio, ei religio, whose realm his religion. The phrase itself was formulated later, but it captures the principle at the heart of the peace. Territorial rulers within the empire could choose between Catholicism and Lutheranism for their territories. Subjects who would not conform were, in principle, allowed to emigrate. This was not religious freedom in the modern sense. It was not individual conscience enthroned above authority. It was princely conscience given territorial force. The ruler's confession shaped the land. A man living in a village did not receive the right to design his own religion. He received the consequences of his ruler's decision. If the prince was Lutheran, church life could become Lutheran. If the prince was Catholic, the old faith remained or returned. The empire did not solve the problem by making every soul free. It solved the problem by assigning religious choice to territorial authority. That is why the peace was both brilliant and cruel. Brilliant, because it recognized what had become politically unavoidable. Lutheran territories could not simply be erased without tearing the empire apart. Cruel, because it turned ordinary believers into subjects of a confessional map. Imagine a village church in 1555 or soon after. The building is the same. The fields around it are the same. The dead in the graveyard have not moved, but the altar may change. The mass may disappear or return. Images may be removed, preserved, or restored. The language of worship may shift. The schoolmaster may teach different doctrine. The priest may marry or be replaced. A family that had lived through decades of uncertainty now learns that the religion of its territory has become official because a ruler far above them belongs to one confession and not another. Peace arrives, but it arrives through command. The Peace of Augsburg also contained limits that would matter terribly later. It recognized Catholicism and Lutheranism. It did not recognize Calvinism. That exclusion was not a small technicality. Calvinist communities and rulers would grow in importance in later decades, especially in parts of the empire, such as the Palatinate. By leaving Calvinists outside the recognized settlement, Augsburg created a legal structure that matched the crisis of the 1550s, but not the religious future of Europe. A peace designed for two confessions would face a world of more than two. There was also the ecclesiastical reservation. If an ecclesiastical prince, for example, a bishop or archbishop ruling church territory, converted to Lutheranism, he was supposed to resign his office rather than convert the territory with him. This clause mattered because church lands were not only spiritual jurisdictions, they were political territories. If bishops could become Lutheran and keep their lands, the Catholic structure of the empire might shrink dramatically. Catholics saw the reservation as necessary protection. Protestants saw it as unequal. Once again, The peace contained future conflict inside its own wording. There were further complications, including protections for certain existing Protestant communities in ecclesiastical territories, sometimes associated with the Declaratio Ferdinandi. But ambiguity remained. As often in the Holy Roman Empire, the settlement worked partly because not every contradiction was forced into immediate clarity. Ambiguity could prevent war. It could also postpone it. For Charles V, Augsburg was a defeat of vision, even if it preserved the empire. He did not personally attend the final negotiations in the way his younger self might have wanted to dominate them. Ferdinand handled the practical imperial settlement. Charles soon abdicated his various crowns and titles in stages, dividing Habsburg responsibilities between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family. In 1556, he withdrew from power. This was not only personal exhaustion, it was historical exhaustion. The man who had tried to defend a universal Catholic order discovered that his empire could survive only by legalizing the division he hated. That is the tragedy of Charles V. He won battles. He captured princes. He presided over diets. He possessed more lands than almost any European ruler before him. But he could not make Christendom one again. The Peace of Augsburg reveals the Holy Roman Empire's deepest survival mechanism. When it could not resolve a contradiction, it often tried to organize it. The Golden Bull had organized electoral fragmentation. Augsburg organized religious fragmentation. In both cases, the empire bought survival by turning conflict into law. But there was a difference. Electoral fragmentation could be ritualized. 7 electors could gather, vote, bargain, and produce a king. Religious fragmentation reached deeper. It entered churches, schools, marriages, funerals, calendars, sermons, and the fear of damnation. It shaped how people understood truth itself. A prince could compromise over a toll. A city could negotiate over a privilege. A bishop could bargain over a jurisdiction. But salvation was harder to split politely. Augsburg therefore created peace, but not reconciliation. Catholic and Lutheran estates could now live inside one imperial framework, but they did so with suspicion. Each side watched the other's legal moves. Each disputed conversion mattered. Each church territory became sensitive. Each imperial diet could revive old tensions. Each new ruler's confession could change the fate of subjects beneath him. The empire had not ended religious conflict. It had territorialized it. That word is essential. Before the Reformation, religious conflict had certainly existed, but the ideal of one Latin Christendom remained powerful. After Augsburg, confession became attached to political space. Territory became Catholic or Lutheran by authority of its ruler. Law did not merely regulate belief, it mapped belief. This changed the emotional geography of the empire. A traveler could move from one territory to another and cross not only a toll boundary, but a confessional boundary. Church bells might mean Mass in one town and Lutheran service in the next. A university might train clergy for one confession while another territory banned their books. A marriage alliance could become religious strategy. A succession could become a spiritual crisis. A bishop's conversion could threaten constitutional balance. The empire survived because it was flexible enough to contain this. The empire weakened because it had to contain this. In the decades after Augsburg, there were periods of relative calm. That must be remembered. The peace did work in the sense that it prevented immediate total religious war within the empire. Many rulers wanted stability. Many communities adjusted. Imperial institutions continued. The empire did not slide instantly into the 30 Years' War. But beneath the calm, pressure remained. Calvinism spread without full legal recognition. Catholic reform strengthened after the Council of Trent. Jesuit education, Lutheran orthodoxy, territorial church building, and confessional discipline hardened boundaries. Princes became more skilled at using religion as statecraft. Subjects learned that the ruler's faith could decide public life. The peace of 1555 had been built for a crisis already in motion, not for all the crises coming next. That is why Augsburg feels less like a conclusion than a locked door with fire behind it. It stopped one war. It preserved one empire. It protected one generation from immediate collapse. But it did so by accepting that the Holy Roman Empire was no longer the political body of one Christendom. It was now a legal structure holding rival Christian confessions in uneasy balance. And balance is not the same as peace. Balance requires constant pressure from both sides. It requires fear of falling. It requires each participant to believe that the cost of breaking the system is higher than the cost of living inside it. For a while, that belief held. Then came new rulers, new doctrines, new ambitions, new memories, and new provocations. By the early 17th century, the settlement of Augsburg looked increasingly insufficient. The empire contained Catholic revival, Lutheran rites, Calvinist ambition, Habsburg authority, princely autonomy, Bohemian tension, and foreign powers waiting for advantage. The empire had survived by dividing religion into territories. But once religion became territory, every territorial conflict could become sacred again. The next explosion would begin in Bohemia, and when it came, it would not remain a local revolt. It would become the war that made the empire eat itself. The war began in a room, not on a battlefield, not with armies already marching across the Rhine, not with Sweden, France, Spain, Denmark, and the Habsburgs all openly tearing at the body of Central Europe. It began with a group of angry Protestant nobles climbing into Prague Castle in May 1618, confronting imperial officials and turning a constitutional crisis into an act of violence so theatrical that history could not forget it. They threw men out of a window. This was the defenestration of Prague. The victims survived the fall, a fact Catholics and Protestants would interpret differently. Catholics could see divine protection. Protestants could mock the survival as less miraculous and more earthly. But the meaning of the event did not depend on whether the men died. The meaning was that obedience had broken in Bohemia, and in the Holy Roman Empire, local disobedience could become universal disaster. Bohemia was not a minor border province. It was an electoral kingdom within the empire. Its king held one of the votes that helped choose the emperor. It had its own estates, privileges, religious tensions, and political memory. After the Peace of Augsburg, the empire had lived by a system that tried to contain religious difference through territorial law. But Bohemia was more complicated than the clean formula suggested. Nobles, towns, royal power, Catholic revival, Protestant rites, and Habsburg dynastic ambition all pressed against one another. The immediate background was the Letter of Majesty of 1609, granted by Emperor Rudolf II, which had given certain religious rights to Bohemian Protestants. Those rights became a battleground. Protestants believed their liberties were being violated. Catholic and Habsburg authorities saw resistance as disobedience. The question was not simply whether one church could be built or closed. It was whether the Bohemian estates could defend their privileges against a Catholic Habsburg ruler. By 1618, Ferdinand of Styria had been accepted as King of Bohemia. That terrified many Protestants. Ferdinand was not a vague Catholic monarch. He was deeply committed to Catholic restoration. In his hereditary lands, he had already supported strong counter-Reformation measures. To Protestant nobles in Bohemia, his accession looked like the beginning of a slow suffocation. First officials, then courts, then churches, then privileges, then the soul of the kingdom itself. So they acted. The window at Prague Castle became the point where decades of legal tension, religious fear, and aristocratic politics fell into open rebellion. But the rebellion did not yet have to become a European war. That is important. History can make the 30 Years' War look inevitable because we know the ending. But in 1618, the crisis still had choices inside it. The Bohemian estates could have been crushed quickly, negotiated with, isolated, or supported. Other Protestant powers could hesitate or intervene. Catholic princes could calculate. Foreign rulers could wait. Every decision widened or narrowed the fire. The Bohemian rebels made one especially dangerous choice. In 1619, they deposed Ferdinand and offered the Bohemian crown to Frederick V, Elector Palatine. Frederick was a Calvinist prince, married to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of James I of England. His acceptance of the Bohemian crown transformed the crisis. This was no longer only a dispute between Bohemian estates and their Habsburg king. It now involved an imperial elector taking a crown from a Habsburg ruler who, in the same year, became Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. The empire's constitutional body had turned against itself. A king of Bohemia had been rejected. An elector had accepted his throne. A Calvinist had entered a settlement that Augsburg had never properly recognized. A Habsburg emperor now faced rebellion inside one of the most important territories of the empire. The old peace could not hold. Frederick V would later be remembered as the Winter King, because his rule in Bohemia lasted only one winter. The nickname is almost cruel in its simplicity. It makes him sound like a foolish dreamer who stepped onto a throne he could not defend. There is truth in that, but also danger. Frederick's choice was not only personal vanity. It reflected the hopes of Protestant networks, the ambition of the Palatinate, distrust of Habsburg power, and the wider question of whether the empire's Catholic revival could be stopped. But hope does not stop armies. Ferdinand II found allies. The Catholic League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, supported him. Spanish Habsburg power mattered as well. The rebellion's enemies were better organized and more decisive than its friends. England did not give Frederick the support his marriage ties suggested. Many Protestant powers hesitated. The Bohemian cause stood exposed. In November 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain near Prague, the rebellion was crushed. The battle itself was short compared with the consequences it released. White Mountain destroyed the Bohemian revolt. Frederick fled. Ferdinand imposed harsh punishment. Rebel nobles were executed in Prague. Confiscations remade the land-holding elite. Catholic restoration advanced with force. The old Bohemian estates lost much of their political independence. The Habsburgs turned victory into restructuring. For Bohemia, this was catastrophe. For the empire, it was a warning. Ferdinand II had shown that rebellion could be broken and Catholic authority restored. But he had also shown Protestant princes what defeat might look like if Habsburg power grew unchecked. Confiscated lands, lost privileges, forced religious change, political humiliation. These were not abstract fears. They had happened. The war should perhaps have ended there. It did not, because every victory in the Holy Roman Empire created fear somewhere else. The next phase widened the conflict. The Palatinate, Frederick V's own territory, became a target. Spanish forces and Catholic League troops moved against it. The transfer of Frederick's electoral dignity to Maximilian of Bavaria in 1623 changed the balance of the imperial constitution. An elector had been stripped. Another had been elevated. Confession, punishment, and constitutional order were now fused together. This mattered deeply. If an emperor could remove an elector and reward a Catholic ally with his vote, then Protestant princes had reason to fear that the empire's legal structure itself could be weaponized. The Golden Bull had made electors the makers of kings. Now, one of those positions had been redistributed as punishment inside a confessional war. The empire's constitution was no longer a stabilizing frame. It was part of the battlefield. Then came Denmark. Christian IV of Denmark was not only King of Denmark, he was also Duke of Holstein, a prince within the empire. His intervention in the 1620s reflected religious concern, political ambition, and fear that Habsburg power might dominate northern Germany. Like so many interventions in the 30 Years' War, it came wrapped in principle and interest at the same time. Ferdinand's side gained a new weapon in Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein is one of the war's most unsettling figures, a military entrepreneur on a scale the empire had rarely seen. He raised armies through a system of contributions, occupation, credit, and coercion. He did not simply command soldiers. He organized war as a machine that fed on the territories it entered. This was a new kind of horror. A prince's army might once have been tied more closely to dynastic lands and feudal obligation. Wallenstein's forces represented something larger, more mobile, and more predatory. Armies in the 30 Years' War did not merely fight battles. They lived off civilians. They extracted money, food, horses, shelter, and obedience. They brought disease, inflation, rape, fire, and hunger. For a village, the difference between Catholic and Protestant soldiers could matter less than the fact that soldiers had arrived at all. A peasant hiding grain under floorboards did not first ask whether the men outside served Ferdinand Christian IV, Wallenstein, Sweden, or some local commander. He asked whether his children would eat after the boots left. That is the human truth of the war. High politics created the conflict. Ordinary people paid the daily tax. By 1629, imperial power looked triumphant again. Denmark had been defeated. The emperor issued the Edict of Restitution, demanding the restoration of many ecclesiastical properties secularized since 1552. To Catholics, this was a correction of past theft. To Protestants, it was a direct assault on decades of settlement, property, worship, and political security. The edict was legally and religiously explosive. It did what the Peace of Augsburg had avoided doing fully. It reopened the question of church lands across the empire. Bishops, princes, city councils, abbeys, and local communities suddenly faced the possibility that property and authority long treated as settled could be reversed by imperial command. Ferdinand II had overreached. Even some Catholic princes became uneasy.